Oh, what to do with French is so bright. Classic Cuban smooth eats, barbecue or roast beef. French's mustard creamy too.
Make it classic or now smooth and creamy. French's, flavor on.
I have omitted all references to where I live because no one's even supposed to know about this. The government has been quite clear about what happens if we share our story. I hope there's no way they can trace my identity through this. I've been living in my basement for the past 5 weeks. My dad lives with me too. I went I guess, to a local community college, staying at home to save rent. My mom disappeared at about the same time we both were trapped inside of our house. I guess I should make a correction. I don't technically live in my basement. My dad and I go upstairs every once in a while to restock on food from our big walk-in pantry. For the most part though, we have everything we need down here. A twin-size bed for me, a sleeping bag for my dad. He insisted that I take the bed. A fully stocked fridge and freezer, piles of canned goods, a lifetime supply of batteries, a generator, basically everything you would need for the apocalypse, which has more or less happened. See, when I came home one night from class, I don't remember when it was exactly, I heard this weird noise outside. Where we live, coyotes aren't too uncommon, so I figured that must be it. After all, it did sound like one. The noise was part whine, part growl. I almost forgot about it, to be honest. And those kinds of things didn't faze me anymore. Also, I was playing video games and I didn't want to be interrupted. It only caught my attention when it started to growl. I refer to the thing as it because I still have no idea what it was. I don't think anyone does. At this point, I went over to my window to look. There was nothing in sight. I figured it was on a different side of the house, so I went through a couple different rooms and I looked out of the windows. Nothing. It was getting dark, so I knew I might have missed it. I could still hear the noise intermittently. When I was going through the rooms the second time, my mom stopped me. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Lose something?" "No. Do you hear that growling? It's really getting on my nerves. I can't focus." She rolled her eyes. I tried to explain in the past how most video games actually required focus. Like most moms, she didn't understand how that could be possible. She probably thought that it was like watching a TV show or something. My mom and I stood still. After a few seconds, the growls resumed. "Yeah, I do hear that," she said. "Probably just a coyote." "Mom, coyotes don't sound like that," I said. It gurgled in response, a noise I hadn't heard before and never hoped to hear again. Imagine someone gurgling mouthwash, except they're also choking at the same time. That's as close as I can describe the sound. She frowned, more annoyed than worried. "We should call the police, I guess." At the time, it seemed like a good idea. And to be honest, I don't think there was much else to do. At some point, one of us would have had to go outside. My dad worked from home, but my mom went shopping most days, and I of course had classes. It doesn't matter now. She called and they showed up pretty fast. Most of the time, it took half an hour or longer for them to respond to non-emergencies. Part of that was probably because our town is small, and the police department is predictably understaffed. Well, I guess they weren't for the most part, but there were times that we could have used more people, like that night. They arrived 10 minutes after the call. One of them knocked on the door and my mom went to answer. I had gone back up to my room, so I only heard pieces of conversation. My focus had returned to video games. The door closed and I guessed that my mom had gone outside for some reason. I dropped my controller when I heard screaming outside. I had been playing COD and my character got lit up on screen. My focus, however, had shifted entirely to the noises outside. What sounded like a roar echoed down the street, followed by more screams and a gunshot. I had never understood how people could freeze up in emergencies. There had been a man the past year that had watched, slack-jawed, as someone else had gotten mauled by a bear. No one blamed him for his inaction, of course, and I didn't either. You can't exactly fight a bear without a gun. I just couldn't imagine being in that kind of shock. I understand now. As I listened to the last couple screams, I finally found the ability to move. Part of me was denying what I've heard, that there was no way my mom could have been dead. I was thinking worst case scenario when I knew it. First of all, I didn't even know what had happened. It was possible that no one was hurt, that whatever animal had been outside had been killed. I knew that was wishful thinking though. Something had gone wrong. I'm still not sure what happened. All I know is that I went downstairs to look out our living room window. There was a trail of blood in the driveway, and a couple of scraps of what had probably been an officer's uniform. That was it. No bodies, no stray gun, no other signs of violence. It should have been impossible. At that point, my dad said something behind me. I was still pretty shocked, so I didn't hear what he said. When he shook me by my shoulder, I was able to listen. "What happened?" he asked. His face was pale and he was panting like he had just run a marathon. To my horror, I had been doing the same thing. I probably scared him more than the screaming had. I have no idea," I stammered. I pointed out of the window at the trail of blood. My dad took one look and ran into the kitchen. "I'm calling the police," he said. "Mom just did that," I pointed out. And then I remembered that my dad had been working in the office, probably with his headphones on. He used to own a local shop before all this shit happened, and he worked from home more times than not. I realized that he wouldn't have heard any conversation, though we clearly had heard the screams. He almost dropped the phone. "Your mother was out there," he said calmly. "Yeah." I didn't elaborate. There was no need. I sat down heavily on one of the couches. My dad went ahead and placed the call. They said that they would send another unit out immediately, but we never heard back. We didn't hear anything that evening, no matter how many times we called or frantically searched Google. My dad gave up after calling to check in for the third time.
It's a whole other world here at Busch Gardens Tampa Bay, with over 70 craft brews and mouth-watering dishes, plus live music every weekend during Beer Fest. Experience Busch Gardens Tampa Bay. For a limited time, buy a single-day ticket, get a second one free.
We spent the rest of the evening in silence. Neither of us remembered to eat. I never had much of an appetite anyways. We didn't speak much about what had happened. I brought up the fact that Mom could be hurt or dead, though I didn't say explicitly, and he silenced me. He knew that it wasn't good to talk about it, not until we knew more details. I didn't get much sleep that night. Video games could not distract me from the thing that had taken my mom. I gave up after a few minutes. Not even Reddit could distract me, and so I just laid on my bed and stared at the ceiling until, mercifully, I fell asleep. My dad woke me up the next morning. "You have to come see this," he said. The grim look on his face, combined with the prior day's events, were rough enough to jolt me awake. The local news was on. A blurred photo of something was shown on screen with a giant question mark above it. I couldn't make out details except for fur and what looked like 4 limbs. The photo had clearly been taken while the person was running. The background was blurred too. Last night, there was an attack at Redacted, the reporter was saying. People claimed they had heard a strange growling noise before an unnamed woman called the police. And that's where the story ends. No one heard back from the police or the neighbors. A second squadron was sent to investigate, but they found no clues of what had happened. We are still waiting for further information. Damn it, I called them, Dad said. They just didn't pick up. I was willing to chalk up their incompetence to the police department. As I said earlier, we live in a small town. To be fair, I had no idea that they were lying. The day crawled along. I tried getting some work done, that I had a couple days off from school, but I couldn't focus. Every other minute took me back to the bloody driveway, and the mystery of what had happened. I wanted to think my mom was okay. My dad felt the same, although he locked himself in his office for 10 hours. My first thought was that he wanted to avoid talking to me, because he didn't know what to say. Much later, I would realize that he was giving me much needed space. I had to digest the uncertainty and fear in my own, before I would even come close to talking with him. Much of that day was spent staring at the wall. I'm usually productive, but I guess no one would be in my circumstances. It didn't matter anyways. School dropped off my radar pretty fast. More news trickled in that evening. My dad and I were eating a mostly silent dinner of soup. We had spoken a little, but there was not much to be said. We were both in a sort of denial, convinced that my mom would come back at some point, or at least that we would find her. It may have been for the best that it was left unknown, knowing what the monster has done since. The same news guy was on, though he looked more frazzled than he had earlier. His hair was a mess and there were pronounced rings under his eyes. We've had reports of 10 different police officers going missing, he said. There was more, but that first sentence was all that I had remembered. I hadn't even known that there were 10 people in the entire police department, and that many had gone missing. We were in deep shit. And worse, there were video clips obviously taken from people's smartphones of people in black suits surrounding the area. The governor made a statement later saying that there was a federal intervention going on in our town, and that everyone was advised to keep their distance. Pretty cheesy, I know, except it wasn't funny then. Still isn't, really. No one knew what was going on. The feds could have been in the Men in Black or something. I can't rule anything out. It didn't take them long to lock the place down. No one was to enter or leave the neighborhood. Other residents were advised to temporarily leave town, because there was a shit ton of government traffic in the area. 2 nights after the feds arrived, my dad questioned their motives. "You think they're really the government?" he asked over breakfast. "I think it's a load of shit. They just don't want to admit their mistakes. It's a cover-up, probably." My dad didn't usually buy into conspiracy theories. That gives you an idea of how serious this whole thing had become. And worse, I even believed him. Surely the government order, which was later enforced by martial law, couldn't be real. What would they do if someone tried to leave? Arrest them? I wish that had been the case. We learned the next morning that a family had tried to escape. The feds, if that's who they really were, tried to stop them, but they went on ahead. And then they disappeared. No one saw them again. Other family members were baffled. Friends couldn't get in touch with them. Even their car had mysteriously vanished, despite being sighted just 5 minutes from a gas station. I knew what had happened though. The monster had found them, just as it had found my mom, and as it would find many others. Right now, it's been 5.5 weeks since the monster arrived. I started this entry a couple days ago, but I didn't have the guts to post it. I still haven't, I guess, because of the possible repercussions.
Hey, it's me, your skin. Help me maintain my moisture balance while exfoliating with CeraVe Renewing SA Cleanser.
After a car accident, the insurance company may offer you a tiny check. Don't fall for it, and don't sign anything until you talk to an attorney at Pass & Levine. We'll fight those stingy insurance companies. Don't be a crash dummy. Call Pass & Levine at 1-800-24-7-CRASH.
The government wants to keep a lid on this thing as much as possible. No one cares about small towns, even if a dozen people go missing. The general public will buy into anything the news outlets say. And at this point, I think those outlets are told what to say. The news stopped covering the incident almost as soon as the feds had arrived, and no one's questioned it since. And it's not just the media. Anyone who shares online about it has their post deleted. Most of the time, people tweet out updates or try posting videos of the monster, and it gets taken down within seconds. I tried myself since I got a picture of the thing the other day. My image was no clearer than anyone's. It showed a big, furry, four-legged thing, and it was deleted almost instantly. When I tried again, I found myself locked out of my account. I have no idea how deep this cover-up runs, and my dad was right. I'm sure of it. Whatever's happening here, the government doesn't want people to know about it. We're still in contact with family and friends, at least the ones who are out of state. They have no more luck than we do. They of course believe our story, seeing as they can't get flights to any airport nearby, and that we can't physically leave. Anyone else views our story with skepticism, treating it as another internet conspiracy. And to be fair, I would too. Probably no one's heard of our town or any towns nearby, and our family has no evidence to support what's happening. Everyone in our town, at least the ones we've tried to contact, have left or gone missing. My dad even checked our street one day, bringing his shotgun down with him after we had gone a couple days without hearing the monster. Everything was abandoned. There weren't even feds anymore, or policemen, or anyone of authority. We would have driven out then, had there not been a problem with our car. My dad's still trying to fix the engine. As I write this, I'm not sure what will happen next. My dad insists that we leave soon, but I'm hesitant. After all, that family that tried leaving a month ago vanished, and they had driven as far as 30 miles from our house. Nowhere nearby was safe. A car wasn't adequate protection. Still, we can't stay here forever. We only have so much food, though the neighbors also have left some, and more importantly, I don't think we can stay sane spending a year in isolation. The growling today was worse than usual. It's not uncommon for the monster to stop by. For some reason, it does so semi-daily, yet it never gets close to our house. The monster is only visible from a distance, and even then its presence is uncertain. Without the growling, we would have probably tried leaving by now. So, I guess the noise is a good thing. It usually stays for a few minutes and then leaves for the day. Once, it was gone for a week. My dad managed to fix our car today. It said it was something with the piston. I have no idea how he fixed it or what the hell the piston does. He spent the last couple of weeks researching it online and teaching himself. It's not like we have much else to do. After we got over the shock of everything, I pretty much isolated myself, playing video games and browsing Reddit. My dad and I aren't that close. We did used to do things outside, biking, hiking, fishing, and that's not an option anymore. And so without that, there's not much to do except to sit around. We were both in a good mood tonight with the car being fixed, so I decided to broach the subject. "Do you think we can leave now?" I asked. "I don't know." My dad hesitated. "I guess we should try." He didn't need to say more. Spending a month in isolation leads to a lot of unspoken communication. I knew what he was thinking. We were perfectly safe for now. The creature had never entered anyone's home. It always preyed on those who went outside. And we still had enough food for half a year. Our generator had died, but we have solar panels outside that at least leave us with some electricity. All things considered, we were in a decent place. It's probably a good idea to wait. We still hear the monster most days, and another month of this should be bearable enough. The first weeks were the hardest anyways. I think I'm getting used to being alone. I feel like I should try posting this, but I don't want to get my other accounts deleted. I tried again yesterday to post some images to my Instagram account. Not only did they get deleted, but so did my profile. And when I tried to make another, it gave me a strange error that I had never seen before. Some kind of error code with a bunch of letters and numbers. I suspect it's not a coincidence. My other accounts work for some reason, and there doesn't seem to be much logic to the things that do work. For instance, we can talk with our cousins in Wisconsin as much as we want about the monster. As I've said, they believe us completely, even if no one else does. The problem is, there's no way to change that without getting some photos out. It's not like anyone will come visit our town, and if they did, they would disappear before they could get the word out. For the moment, we'll stay put, but I don't know how long that will last. The temptation of leaving, even with the monster as a threat, is too great. It would have been better if the car had been functional this whole time, so we could have exercised some self-control. I suppose it won't make much difference in the end. It's time to upload this dang story. I don't care anymore. I'm posting it everywhere. My remaining Reddit accounts, 4chan, fanfic websites, anywhere that lets me post stories. It no longer matters if my post makes it out or not. By the end of the day, I'll either be dead or far away from this town. Maybe I'll be able to share its name when I do get out. It'll be nice to talk to other people. The conversations I've had over the phone don't really count. It's hard to convey just how taxing this isolation has been, now that we know we're leaving. The reason we're leaving is simple. The monster is gone. At least we think it is. An old friend of mine who happens to live in my state sent me some frantic text earlier, saying that he knows we haven't talked in forever, but I just had to see something. No one else was responding to him, it seems. I should feel flattered that he remembered me at all. I had to think for a while before I even recognized his face. He sent pictures, like me. He lives in a pretty small town, though it's a little bigger, about 10,000 people versus a couple thousand in mine. There's not just one monster anymore. There are dozens of things. For some reason, all the photos turned out blurry, just like the ones I tried taking. I can't say I'm surprised. I still sometimes find myself doubting what's happened, convinced that I must be going insane. If it weren't for my dad, who has been as stoic as ever, I would have ventured out already and yelled for the thing to come get me. The monster near us hasn't appeared in some time. It's been at least 3 days, maybe 4. I haven't exactly kept track. I think we realized this morning that something was up. Not hearing it had been more noticeable at this point. My dad thinks that it might have moved on, that now is our best chance of escaping. I'm not sure I agree, given how many of my old friends saw, but I can't deny one fact. We'll either leave or die of starvation. It's not a tough decision, even if we might be heading towards our own deaths. I'm ready. I'm sick of waiting. I didn't realize it until our car got fixed, but I've been wasting my life in this house. Sure, we might be going to die outside, but what's the difference if we have to leave anyways? My dad won't wait for us to starve, and I won't either. He risked going over to my neighbor's house this morning. To my surprise, he made it back unscathed. We now have 3 guns and a shit ton of ammunition. The neighbors even had an old Lee Enfield sniper from World War II. It seems to work. My dad tested it out. I told him it was too risky, that the monster could be drawn to us by the noise, until he pointed out that we'll be driving for hours anyway. Plenty of time for that thing to catch us, if it's going to. And we know that, if it wants to, it will. God knows how many it's taken. Wish me luck. I really hope someone reads this. And if I don't make it, but this still gets out there, keep an eye on the news. The second you hear about a strange animal, or see blurry photos of a black and gray behemoth, get the hell out of wherever you live, maybe out of the country. It's possible the monster is averse to heat or cold. Probably cold. If we do make it out, we're headed to Canada. I'll post if we make it out safely, and if this post even survives.
Wake up to the new $5 Bell Breakfast Box, only at Taco Bell.
Hi everyone. A lot has happened since my first post. My phone was dead too, so I couldn't share anything if I wanted to. But to be honest, I kind of forgot about it, with all that's been going on. Anyways, back to when we tried to escape. We left the house without issue. There are 2 roads that go out of my town. One winds south and the other north. And since we were headed to Canada, we took the north road through long stretches of isolated forest. I was pretty nervous to say the least. No one I knew had gotten out of town alive. And worse, there was that friend that had texted me, showing that our monster was just one of many, and that they were beginning to spread. My dad had made his mind up though, and he convinced me of the same. We couldn't have stayed. It would have been like waiting for a death sentence. Better to die trying to escape, which, if you haven't figured it out by now, it worked. We had our first run-in with the monster partway down the northbound road. The thing was fast. We were driving along without issue, and then the car suddenly exploded in front of us as if we had hit something, which we did. I was too dazed at first to notice, and so was my dad, but we noticed the bashed-in hood of the car after a few seconds. There was fur sticking out of one of our headlights, which had broken. Other than that, nothing suggested the monster. Somehow, we did not jump to that conclusion at first. My dad figured he had just missed a deer in the road. It happens all the time. And the fur actually looked like deer fur somehow. It was a dark tan about the length of a phone. Our car still worked, so we kept driving. That was a mistake. About a minute after the accident, I heard the sound of tires being slashed. And don't ask me how that happened while we were moving, I don't know. My dad claims that he didn't even notice until the car began skidding to a stop. When we did stop, my dad cursed. He had first thought that the initial accident had screwed something up, until I told him what I had heard. And that's when he balked. We both knew that the monster had probably been responsible. Sure enough, it emerged from the nearby trees, and it was fast, like supernaturally fast. I swear that in less than a second, it covered 100 feet between us and the woods. And then it was at the car, scrabbling with its claws at my window in the back. It was the first time that I had gotten a good look at the thing. It had a hunched back, kind of like a werewolf, and claws the size of a hand. The fur was indeed the same shade as that of a deer, and the worst was its black, beady eyes, like the eyes of a predator you see in movies. Somehow, it couldn't break through the window. The monster even tried gnawing its way in through with its rows of shark-like teeth. I could only watch in horror as it slobbered on the car. My dad snapped me out of it. "Get the gun!" he yelled at me. I, for some reason, asked him which one. "Any," he said, and so I grabbed the first one I could from the trunk. Thankfully, it was a hatchback. I came up with a shotgun, which was a relief. The sniper would not have been ideal in that situation. My dad had shown me how to fire the guns before he left, with the exception of the sniper. He had said that there was no way I could learn enough in a few minutes. And besides, if we were in a position to use it, he would have time to grab it himself and line up a shot. I had never gone hunting with him, never really had an interest in guns until now, but I paid attention to every detail that he showed me. I had known that our lives might depend on it, like they did then. I brought the already loaded shotgun up and I flicked off the safety, putting the stack up against my shoulder. For a moment, I was too afraid to shoot. The monster was moving to the passenger window, as if that would provide a better entrance. My dad yelled at me to shoot again, and I finally did, wincing as the gun boomed in such an enclosed space. In hindsight, while we didn't have a choice, it was not the smartest thing to do. There could have been shrapnel, especially because my shot caught the upper part of the window, where it bordered the metal of the car. But we got lucky. The monster howled and I could see it pouring red blood onto the ground. It ran back into the woods as fast as it had come. I sat there with the gun, waiting for the longest few minutes after my life. My dad finally told me to lower the gun. There were no more monsters coming. I relented, turning the safety back on and putting the gun on the back seat. "Well, shit," my dad said. "What?" "The car." It took me a moment, but I realized what he was saying. The car was now borderline totaled. In addition to the busted front end, the tires were now slashed. We only had one spare in the back. We were ballsy enough to get out and check the damage. Both of the rear tires were busted, and I mean it. The rubber was shredded, and the metal was gouged at least half an inch deep. I was amazed that the monster hadn't broken into our car. "We'll have to walk," my dad said grimly. I didn't like that idea at all. Yeah, we had heard one of the monsters and nothing was after us at the moment. But I had seen how fast the thing was. If it did decide to come out after us in the open, we would be dead. I doubted I could even pull a trigger faster than the monster ran at us. My dad convinced me to go. If we stayed in the car, he said, it would be the same as hiding in our house. We'd be waiting for the inevitable. Worse, we had brought only a few supplies. Snacks, some PB&Js, water, the guns, and a first aid kit. To be fair, that was all we should have needed. The drive up to Canada was not long, only a few hours at most. We couldn't bring supplies with us either. Neither of us had thought to bring backpacks. Again, the trip wasn't supposed to take long. We figured that any delays would end with us dead. No point in overstocking the car. I suppose that was pretty stupid in hindsight. We each took a gun. I kept the shotgun since I knew I could use it. My dad took a 9mm pistol he had nabbed in what he had most likely been an illegal auction. I didn't care now though. At that time, my mom had criticized him for it. There was plenty of ammo, so we stuffed our pants in coat pockets. We did not bring any food or water. My dad knew there was a convenience store 4 miles away, and more supplies would have bogged us down. The guns and ammo were already enough to carry. It took the better part of 2 hours to walk there. For most of that walk, I expected to die. My hands shook so hard that I dropped the shotgun twice. Thank God I had remembered to turn on the safety before. I would have blown one of us apart otherwise. I even fingered the trigger when I saw movement at one point. It had been a squirrel and I didn't care about shooting the thing, but I did worry about it attracting the monster with noise. I knew that my dad had been right, that there was no point hiding inside the car, but I wanted to run back there after a few minutes. Starving had more appeal than being torn apart by a monster. We made it without issue. By the time we walked into that store, I was dead tired. My anxiety had worn off and I had already been running on fumes. The first thing I did was set my shotgun down and curl up in a waiting chair in the back. We stayed there for 3 days. Neither of us were eager to leave. There were a lot of non-perishables in the store. The doors could be double bolted, and there was even a microwave in the back. Plus, there was a cellar with an entrance from the inside, which went down about 30 feet into the ground. We were as safe there as we had been in our own home. Mostly, I think we were waiting. There were no more sightings of a monster, but with the half dozen windows and glass door in the place, we expected a monster to at least come sniffing. Nothing bothered us. There were no people either, which bothered me. Since that road was one of two going out of our town, it usually had a lot of traffic. We did not spot a single car in our time at the store. There weren't even any in the small parking lot, unless you count the rusted Volkswagen Beetle frame sitting on the grass. That thing had been there since my dad was a kid. No one bothered to tow it, and it kind of became a novelty over time. We took our time figuring out what to do. My dad and I knew that whatever we decided next would determine whether we made it out alive. We were in no rush either. Being in a store stocked with food, water, and heat, there was even a cellar that we could have retreated to had the monster tried to break in, and we even found some sleeping bags down there. Our first idea came from me, and it was pretty much shot down immediately. I thought we could call someone for help. Not the police, since they all went missing before, but a friend or someone else nearby. My dad pointed out that no one would want to come pick us up with the monsters roaming around, and they probably couldn't. We suspected that the government was keeping everyone out. They hadn't kept us from leaving, true, but they probably couldn't. Staying in that town would have been a death sentence. Not to mention that our phones were dead. Neither of us had thought to bring chargers. If we would have only spent a few hours on the road as planned, we wouldn't have needed them, and we would have just bought some in Canada. But that decision was starting to look really bad, along with the many other things that we had neglected.
The Thai cyber community makes me feel that I'm not alone.
My dad thought for a while that we could just wait for a car to drive down the road, and that we could signal it with our guns. Not a terrible idea really, and a lot better than mine. Just one problem. There were still no cars, even after 2 days of waiting. No signs of life either, which was good because we didn't see the monster, but it was also strange. There were usually animals roaming the woods. We settled on a new plan when it became clear cars weren't coming. I suppose we could have been more patient. It didn't make sense to wait though, not with the one monster around and the possibility of more trying to break in. Our situation had become no different than before. When we decided to leave home, we would either leave or stay put and die. My dad knew that the police department was 10 miles or so down the road. He had been very hesitant to consider walking, and for good reason. 10 miles would take hours to cover, plenty of time for a monster to ambush us, which would likely end in our death. I also suspected that, during our walk to the store, we had not gotten lucky at all. The monster I had shot was probably the only one in the area. It would not have to come after us so soon after being attacked, but 3 days had passed and it might have shaken off its hesitation at this point. It wasn't much of a choice really. We had nowhere else to go and the store was like a ticking time bomb. My dad suggested at one point that maybe I had killed the monster, and that was why it hadn't bothered us. I doubted that seriously. I also knew that there were more monsters, a lot more in the nearby town, the one my friend had texted me from. If they decided to come near us, we were probably screwed. And so, early that afternoon, we decided to leave. There were no backpacks in the store either, and we didn't want to lug grocery bags around with our guns to carry. It wouldn't be too long, we figured, and our problems would be resolved in one way or another at the police department. If someone was alive there, or there was some means of escape, we would take it. And if not, well, the nearest town was still 60 miles away, too far to bother walking, and there were monsters there. The police department would have to help us in some way, and if it didn't, then we were really screwed, and we would just wait it out in the store, praying desperately for a rescue of some sort. Or we would just kill ourselves before that happened. That walk was even worse than the one from before, when we had left our ruined car behind. As I said, I had suspected the monster had left us alone that first day because of its injury. There was no reason it wouldn't come back now. Without the safety of our car, we would have no chance against it, not with how fast it moved. I tried not to think about these things as we walked, but it was impossible not to. Even when we saw the building appear in the distance, my heart was still racing. I thought that I had felt stressed during finals week. That was a joke compared to this. Anything I had experienced could not compare to the anxiety that I felt out there. If you've ever feared for your life for any reason, you know what I mean. Fortunately though, nothing happened. We made it into the building in one piece, without having seen a hint of a monster. I was inclined to believe that, just maybe, the monsters were all gone. Until my dad pointed out that there was still no one on the road. People would have returned to our town if it was safe. The police department was not large and it had a waiting room, a few jail cells, 3 offices, and a break room. That was it. So it did not take us long to search the place and determine that no one was around. We were not surprised. We had heard the reports when all this shit started, that there had been missing police officers in the area. They were all dead by then, I was sure of it. The place had been left alone for a long time. Whoever had last left it had left it clean too. There was no food sitting out in the break room, no waste in the trash cans, no papers scattered in desks. All the lights had been turned off too. It was like a museum. I would have almost preferred to see some signs of a chaotic departure, or bloodstains to suggest a fight that had occurred. There was nothing. The emptiness did nothing to calm my nerves. My dad remained stoic, probably to comfort me. He must have been scared like I was though, because anyone would have been. But still, he didn't shy away from anything we did. And he always made sure that I was eating enough, even when we had spent time in the store. He was frustrated by our search, to say the least. He knocked over a computer monitor in the waiting area and shattered it, throwing curses at the walls. That wasn't the end of it either. He went on to break the water dispenser, throw a chair at the wall, rip up magazines by the front door. I finally got him to calm down when I said that the monster might hear all the noise. A bullshit thing to say, I know, because wouldn't the monster have heard us before? And while it had looked scary as hell, it hadn't seemed as supernatural or anything. Besides its speed, that was. My dad went out the back entrance towards the parking lot. He figured it was worth checking, since we had walked all that way to get here. And it paid off. There was a police car on the lot and it had its keys in the ignition. Problem was, the seat was covered in blood. I thought I was going to throw up looking at it. Somehow, I kept my food down and I went back. There had been rolls of paper towels in the break room, and I grabbed one of them to bring back out. The seat took a while to clean off. My dad insisted that it was unnecessary, since he would be the one driving and he didn't care. But I did. I didn't want his clothes to get soaked with blood, because anyone we saw across the border would get very suspicious. He relented at that thought. We did clean it though. We realized, of course, that there would be questions at the border regardless. We had the audacity to bring our passports, but the police car clearly had our town name written on it, and we were not police officers. My dad said that we would figure it out when we got there, that it wasn't worth worrying about when there were more pressing matters at hand. He didn't know how true that statement would become. Before we could get in, there was a rustling noise behind us. I froze, but my dad spun immediately, both hands on his pistol. I saw him turn off his safety, but that was as far as he got. The monster was on him a millisecond later. I couldn't see anything beneath the monster's panting flesh. Its head was bent over my dad like a starving dog. I probably waited too long to shoot it, but I did. I caught it in the shoulder, and it howled like it had earlier. I noted absent-mindedly that it was the same monster too. There was a crusted over wound on its side, exactly where I had shot it from the car. It backed off, and my dad stumbled to his feet. He was covered in blood and slobber. I couldn't tell if he was alright, and I didn't have time. The monster came after me next. To say that it was terrifying does not do it justice. Having the thing bowl me over and then stand on top of me, slobbering like a beast, leaning its head close to mine, feeling its hot breath on my face. It was too much. I couldn't move, looking at the thing. I doubt I could have moved regardless, since it had my arms pinned beneath its weight. It was heavier than it looked, and it didn't look like a lightweight. I thought my bones were going to break beneath the thing. It was squeezing the air out of my lungs too, which didn't help. For some reason, it did not go after me like it did my dad. It spent a half a second observing me with a sort of withdrawn intelligence. Its eyes shifted over my face, eager but furtive, looking at the gun still in my hand. I'm not sure if it made the connection between its wound and the gun, but I would have bet that it did. I heard several gunshots. The monster flinched and then fell on its side. Blood was pouring out of its head. I stared at it in shock from my place on the ground. It returned my gaze with a lifeless stare. My dad was okay somehow. He had a few cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. I was worried about infection. My dad said that it was the least of our concerns. We just had to get the hell out of there. As for me, I was just shaken up. I was covered in the monster's slobber, which did make me throw up this time. Or maybe the sight of the monster made me do that, lying in a pool of its own blood. We went into the bathroom to wash up, and there was still running water somehow, and we went back to the car. My dad didn't waste any time. Even though we were tired, he poured the gas and set off down the road. Eventually, we made it to the border without any other encounters. I think we relaxed once we saw cars on the road again. I know I did. My dad, as unreadable as he had been before, at least let up on the gas pedal. The last thing we needed was a speeding ticket. The guys at the border didn't question us, or even mention that we were in a cop car. They just looked at our passports and then let us go. Maybe they had thought that we were officers off duty, or they had seen other police come through before. Whatever the case, I was happy to avoid trouble. We're now living in the Toronto metro area. My dad had a lot of money saved up from his store, and I'm starting up college again, so I should be able to work soon. He also found a part-time job as a senior manager at a local chain. I guess they were impressed by his resume, though it did not make any mention of the monsters. In fact, the monsters haven't even made the news up here. I still don't know how our government kept it a secret. We still can't post about it though. My previous post got deleted when I mentioned our town's name. For some reason though, they didn't delete my account. Maybe because my first post stayed up. As far as I know, the monsters haven't left our state. We called our other friends that live there, and they know nothing about it. My other friend, the one that texted me before we left, hasn't responded. I fear the worst for him. It'll be hard adjusting to life in a new country. A new environment for that matter. We lived in small towns our whole life. The suburbs aren't that busy, but there are still more people than we're used to. And my college is way bigger than the one that I used to attend. It's also been hard living without Mom. I don't really need to elaborate on that. Most of you reading this have probably lost someone close, and you know how it is. For what it's worth, I think my dad and I have taken it well. Although we're still sad about what had happened, my dad and I are happy now, I think. We'll actually have a chance to live again. After spending over a month in hell, we deserve it.
Which diseases could go untreated if Congress passes government price setting? Tell Congress there's a better way to lower costs without risking new medicines.
it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. I explored Area 51 using astral projection. Part 1. I had my first out-of-body experience when I was 4 years old. I remember having a vivid dream that took place inside my bedroom, and then suddenly halfway waking up and seeing my own body from above as I floated in the air of the dark room. Having no idea what was happening, I screamed, and I kept screaming until I could finally hear my own cries that forced me awake. Well, this began to happen again and again, more frequently. My parents had gone from comforting me every night to becoming worried and sometimes annoyed. I took medication that ridded me of what they saw as night terrors, and was then weaned off the pills by the time I was 6. Well, my OBE started up again, but I was older then and not as frightened. Before long, I was teaching myself how to control it. I could float around my room. It was fun. It beat the hell out of any old regular dreams, sometimes even the lucid ones, which I'm also no stranger to. I soon began to expand my territory. I couldn't touch or interact with anything while outside of my body, so my options for nightly entertainment in my room were limited. Floating through the toy chest and seeing the insides of my stuffed animals was only fun for so long, so I trained my strange superpower and increased its range. After a month or so of trying, I was able to explore the rest of our house. I could watch late-night television with my parents without them ever knowing, although I had no say in what channel was on. Nights they watched HBO or one of their R-rated movies, and they were the best. Sound was always limited in a projected state. Voices were muffled, like people speaking underwater. But luckily for me, my mum was hard of hearing, so she always watched TV with the captions on, which benefited my viewing experience during my nightly escapades. It also had me reading at a high school grade level by age 8. I think I kind of assumed at first that everyone had my ability. It was part of what it meant to be a human. But after I brought up how I flew around the house at breakfast a couple of times, and they just told me it sounded like a fun dream, I realized that I really could do something special. Sometimes I'd even use it to spy on my dad when he wrote his stories late at night on his computer in his office. I always found it funny how mad he'd get when computer programs weren't working, or he couldn't figure something out. He also had some interesting midnight snack recipes. Well, he was a cool dad all around. For example, when I was 7 in the summer of 1996, he took me to see Independence Day. Looking back, I was probably a little too young for all the destruction and alien violence, but there's always one set piece that interested me, which I looked forward to seeing each time the movie was on TV or playing on a well-worn VHS tape. Well, with the title I've given this story, you can probably see where I'm going with this. Yes, it was the Area 51 stuff in the film that stuck with me the most. I was fascinated by the movie creators' designs and ideas about what the secretive military base looked like. I thought they'd filmed the scenes inside the real place, like they'd gotten special access to some big underground extraterrestrial workshop right out of science fiction. I later rationalized that they just knew what the place looked like and recreated it. And it wasn't until I was 9 until I comprehended that they completely made it up. Well, that realization both disappointed and fascinated me. I had to know what was really down there, how it ran, what experiments they might have been running, what kind of people worked there, and, of course, whether or not they actually had aliens or their technology locked up in some secretive warehouse in the middle of a desert. By the time I was 10 and our house had internet access, I was gulping up the classic conspiracy theories about the base, going from one GeoCities or Angel Fireside to the next, and eating up every doctored image of alien autopsies and examinations of UFOs that I could find. Games like Half-Life and its Black Mesa compound, or Perfect Dark's take on Area 51, or the titular arcade shooter itself, all scratched an itch, but, well, I knew when I was young just what I wanted to do with my special power. I'd cheat the system. I'd bypass all of that security without anyone ever knowing, without ever having to join the military just to maybe get a shot at seeing the place. And could you blame me? If you could do what I can, wouldn't you try? Well, I wasn't even that far away. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona, Las Vegas was just a day trip, and the ranch, as it's sometimes called, wasn't far past that. Area 51, a legendary producer of American law, was always just past the horizon when I came of age. And one day, I'd see it. The problem was that I'd have to practice every night if I could. The range of my astral projection was my weakness, and I'd have to train myself to extend it. It wasn't like I could just consult with a mentor or look up OE tips and tricks on the internet. When I was in middle school, I learned how some Native American tribes sent their adolescents on vision quests, a spiritual journey involving fasting and praying that, allegedly, sometimes resulted in the sensation of leaving one's body. Elsewhere in the world, various drugs could supposedly trigger out-of-body experiences. None of these things were an option for me, either to learn from or enhance my natural ability. And I try to avoid any drugs entirely. They only inhibit my skill. Even taking an Advil before bed makes the projection muddled and weak. The only way I could get better was by exercising strenuously. I took naps whenever I could, meditated often, and taught myself how to lucid dream every night. Anything to master my inner self. By the time I was 14, I was sometimes getting 12 hours of sleep a day, excessive even for a teenager. Over time, the boundary increased. The dark edges of the astral realm, which I could not breach, expanded outward. My neighborhood became my playground, and I'd go to bed early whenever my body allowed it, give me time to float about and observe the secret lives of our neighbors before everyone else went to bed. Well, you can call me a pervert, I wouldn't blame you, but I'm also not going to share what I've seen, or name names. And my curiosity and its rewards are for me alone. Suffice to say, though, humans are strange. When the veneer we all put on for the public fades away for the day, and we stop being a side character in others' lives, our true selves come out. It turns out every family or couple has its problems, those familiar arguments and little debates. We all have our peculiar hobbies and preferred subject matter that we look up online late at night, when we think no one else is watching. Hey, but I'm not judging. If you lived in Flagstaff while I did, I apologize in advance for the fact that I may have spied on you for a bit at one point or another. Rest assured, though, your secrets are safe with me. I'm not going to say anything about anyone. I just enjoy cheating the laws of the universe and observe without physically being there. But, well, that's no excuse to start gossip. That said, though, I admit that I was no angel. I was a teenage guy for a few years of my life, and sometimes when I took a sick day in high school, I did have a few ghostly visits to the girls' locker room. Before you scold me, let me at least say that I was more fascinated by my astral range at that point than the things that I saw in the gym without others knowing. And that wasn't the only exploring I did at my high school. I go there night after night, up and down its dark halls. How often did you get to be at your school at night? The few times you were, it was probably for some event where all the lights were on. There are fewer things more unnatural in this world than seeing your school in darkness. The shouts and bickering of its loud students, not even a lingering whisper in the air. I often heard things when I visited, but they weren't audible. Rather, they were auditory hallucinations, the trick of a mind, even projected, caused by empty liminal space. Don't forget, whatever I could actually hear would be muffled, so I could tell the difference. Now, I never saw any ghosts or demons or extra-dimensional beings while in a projected state, and I did look. Well, every now and then, I could have sworn another person sensed my presence, or looked right at me, and in those instances, I'd always freeze up for a second. But it was just a coincidence each time, based on my position as I watched them. What attracted their attention was something on TV, or their cat making a noise, or the wind on their curtains. I've never been seen. I don't think it's possible. I've even paid a visit to every psychic in town as they supposedly connected a customer with a deceased loved one to no effect. They were either all frauds or just not very good at their profession. By the time I was out of state and in college, I had a firmer grasp on the reality of everything, including the banality of the place I'd longed to one day break into. I'd accepted by then that, in all likelihood, Area 51 was little more than a secretive military installation where prototype aircraft were housed and flown. Warehouses of spy planes and bombers, many of which were never mass-produced. Maybe it really did have its share of government secrets, but I no longer really believed that it had something more exotic, like aliens and their flying saucers. Life had disenchanted me to the point where I believed the Roswell incident really was just a weather balloon. Apologies to my childhood hero Fox Mulder, but I no longer really cared about believing. And then my dad died in my sophomore year. Having focused on schoolwork and a smaller, more chaotic sleep schedule, and expanded my projection range all throughout college, and the students in my dorm were all so predictable that spying on them got boring. They played video games, got high, sometimes even did their schoolwork, and ignored calls from their parents. But once I came home for winter break to attend the funeral and spend some time with my mum, I got back into my nightly jaunts. And it was sort of my way of grieving, through reliving my youth and remembering how much fun I could have as I simultaneously laid in bed and explored the town. And, truthfully, I was also hoping to somehow find my dad lingering about in that other realm. It was a sudden heart attack that took him out of my life, and I figured that if anyone had unfinished business and a reason to cling on to the world of the living, it'd be him. But he never showed up. Well, I regretted not telling him my secret back then, thinking that if he'd known, maybe he would have tried to speak to me when I was floating around the house, halfway between the corporeal world and whatever is next for us. Well, if there is anything at all. Looking back, there was no logic to my regrets. I was simply coping in my own way. I was, however, awakened to the idea of mortality and how limited our time could really be. And so I made a promise to fulfill the wish of my younger self and see that secretive place out in the desert before I died and perhaps spent the rest of eternity drifting around the world. By that point, I wouldn't have a body to return to and no ability to tell all of you what big secrets I might have uncovered. And certainly, if Area 51 did turn out to be a disappointment, there were so many other places I could check out that most humans would never see. Well, I could visit the bunker under the White House, or get within inches of the radioactive molten slag that made up the Elephant's Foot under the Chernobyl power plant. I could swim around in an active volcano, see the inside of a famous dead person's coffin, count the money in a major bank's vault, and peer into safety deposit boxes, and make bizarre finds throughout a self-storage building. Well, some of those things I'd already done. Actually, not that there's much of interest to see in the region. I spent a night in Las Vegas once, though. Going around its casinos and seeing the security rooms and offices of the owners was one of my highlights by that point. I'm still trying to figure out some way to cheat at the games without getting my kneecaps broken in the process. After college, I spent a few more years refining my techniques and learning how to send my meditative energy further and further outwards. When I first discovered my power, I was restricted to my bedroom. By high school, I could go a few miles out. By college graduation, I was able to get 20 miles away from my body. But the further I got out, the more mentally exhausted I'd be when I returned to my physical self, and the less time I had to project. Part 2. I can move quickly when I explore, much faster than I can when I'm stuck inside muscle and bone. I've learned to catapult myself through the air to get around long distances. It's not quite as good as flying, but it isn't a bad accomplishment for an amateur without a teacher. Those big jumps are a necessity for extended projection. I can't wake up unless I return to my body, and that's the scariest aspect of what I can do. There have been times where I feel I just barely made it back before a piece of myself faded away, and the thought of what might happen if I didn't return before running out of spiritual fuel, or whatever you want to call it, has always been the one thing that's kept me from taking bigger risks. Area 51 will be my toughest challenge yet, just because of the distance I'd have to cover. I'd given some thought to the possibility that the secretive airbase might have some sort of detector able to spot me. It didn't seem likely, but in a world where there are pictures of pretty much everything, the fact that seemingly no one had ever leaked photos from deep inside the place made it enigmatic, like it was detached from the rest of reality. Once I put my mind back to it, I began to obsess about getting inside. Just to see it. I had to see what was inside, if only to put a compulsive curiosity to rest. And then a meme made me move up my schedule. In 2019, a group of a few hundred people showed up to raid Area 51, out of the thousands that had originally planned to participate. Their proclaimed goal was to see them aliens, and that they couldn't all be denied the chance. But of course it turned out to be little more than a party near the base, with only a few arrests. It wasn't that I was worried about them getting inside and messing things up, or causing the military staff to trigger some self-destruct safety measure. I just didn't want them to book up all the nearby rooms. By then I'd gotten my range up to about 30 miles, and I wasn't sure if I could do better, as it simply felt like my upper limit. But if I stayed at Rachel, Nevada, which was around the far north of the base, I thought I could make it work. I reserved a room in the small desert town's motel for an entire week, which was probably one of the longest stays they'd ever seen. And to call it a town was a stretch. The place isn't much more than a rest stop in the middle of nowhere. It has no restaurants outside of the motel, so most of my meals would come from the combination gas station general store. I wasn't expecting to be able to fully explore the base in a single night, but I didn't think it'd be so huge that I wouldn't be able to cover it within my time frame. I went to bed as early as I could my first night at the alien-themed motel, barely able to contain my excitement about the upcoming spiritual break-in. Astral projection, for me at least, is best commenced in a lucid dream state. I can pull it off at limited distances and time while meditating. I used to randomly experience it throughout the night, perceiving it as a regular dream where I just explored my surroundings. But lucid dreaming was the way to do it right, where I could redirect all of my unused physical energy into my formless wandering self, or while I slept comfortably in a warm bed elsewhere. But the first night was, actually, a disappointment. I got there fine, going south and flinging myself across Bald Mountain, where I looked down at the lights of the base itself. Crossing the exterior fence was exciting. Traversing the enclosed desert around the buildings was thrilling. I kept expecting to be surrounded by helicopters and commandos any second, but there I was, strolling right into one of the most fortified places in the world. The problem was, I just couldn't figure out where to go to get into the sublevels. Everyone knew Area 51 has a basement, even without paying a visit, but they didn't make it easy to find a way down. I didn't want to spend too long looking for nothing other than an elevator, just in case something happened and I lost my only chance to see anything at all of actual interest. And so I relegated myself to exploring the aircraft hangars and the administrative offices. I'd done a few trial runs on less secretive air bases, and on the surface, the homey airport area wasn't all that different from the norm. I saw soldiers on patrol, staff making phone calls, people eating in a mess hall or working on computers, vending machines, furniture, bathrooms and locker rooms attached to exercise areas. Everything one would expect to see. Well, it wasn't all that surprising. Area 51 isn't even blurred out on Google Maps. Anything truly meant to be kept away from prying eyes would be out of view of any passing satellite. The hangars I saw only held standard fighter or surveillance aircraft, including a few models from the past. I even saw one of the first American jet fighters in good condition, an F-86, the kind used way back in the Korean War. Couldn't tell you why they were keeping it airworthy. The only element I couldn't fully explore, other than the data on the local servers, were the contents of the file cabinet spread across several of the offices and officer quarters. I just have no way to see what's on papers that are pressed together inside a cabinet. So, physical information wasn't only protected from possible hackers, it also keeps away the prying eyes of projectionists as well. I could have waited around for someone to open a file and read it as I peeked alongside them, but I kept my interest on covering ground instead. Honestly, I'm not a big aircraft or military enthusiast. I'm sure there are a million people out there who'd be fascinated with just exploring the surface freely like I did, but it wasn't enough to make all the effort and planning worth it. I would have to try again on the second night. But if I couldn't find a way down after 3 more attempts, I figured I'd be ready to head home disappointed. You may be thinking that I could just dip myself down into the ground and keep going until I emerged into an alien autopsy room or dark energy reactor. The thing is, dropping beneath solid ground isn't easy. It's slow and navigation is impossible, as I can no longer see anything. I have little sense of orientation or gravity when I project, so if I get disoriented, I could get turned around and end up burrowing towards the center of the earth and never returning to my body. Well, that wasn't something I was about to try, so I was restricted to elevators just like the locals who somehow managed to get assigned to the place. On my second night, I finished exploring the surface buildings and focused my attention on getting down into the abyss below. It occurred to me that such a secretive base had no reason to make the elevators easy to find. I scoured the insides of walls, looking for hidden rooms, but every building I revisited had no apparent means to gain access to the good stuff. A new idea didn't occur to me until I was halfway back to my body as dawn's first light swept the sky. I'd have to wait another day to try it. The hangars. Area 51 was primarily used as a place to test out new aircraft in secrecy. That's what it was originally built to do, in a way that kept anything spying in the sky from catching a glimpse. There had to be at least one hangar, or maybe a few of them, that connected directly to the underground. To let them manufacture their prototypes down below and bring them up for their test flights. What I'd seen so far must have been just the tip of a very big iceberg. Thankfully, my third night of exploration provided the breakthrough I was looking for. I went into one of the empty hangars, and despite no indication whether or not there was something beneath it, I lowered myself through the floor. After passing through about a meter of metal supports, I emerged into an enormous elevator shaft with dozens of lights built into its walls. The hangar was big enough on its own, but here was a whole pneumatic lift system that could raise or lower the entire floor of a structure designed to hold aircraft. It was my first clue that a megastructure lurked under the airport, and I went down about 50 feet until arriving at the bottom. The construction bay was just ahead, and some half-completed modern stealth aircraft occupied its space. Eventually, if they even planned on completing it, it would be wheeled onto the elevator and brought to the surface. But for now, the place was otherwise empty, with no tools or blueprints in sight. The flying wing-style aircraft was in a dull, military grey colour, and its cockpit was empty of any controls. I could have studied the thing all night, even if I wasn't all that invested in aircraft development. Instead, I moved on and began navigating the labyrinthian halls of a realm so few would ever get to see. Large concrete arches held up natural rock, excavated and drilled perhaps decades ago. Forklifts and inactive floodlights lingered in the halls, which were dimly lit up by orange sodium vapor lamps and fluorescent tubes. I didn't see anyone at all in this part of the base. By the end of the night, I'd realized that the first sub-level was barely any more remarkable than the surface. Other than being an impressive engineering feat, it seemed like an area with its glory days long behind it. It had dozens of vacant offices, sealed locker rooms, empty vending machines, and only a few uniformed base staff walked past me during my whole visit. I looked through more hangars, along with storage rooms filled with old experimental aircraft that might have never seen the light of day, and now sat frozen in time under a tarp. I also found some sort of conference room that, for whatever reason, had been buried behind a concrete barrier. It still had its table and chairs, which were right out of the 1960s, and positioned like people had fled the room in a hurry. For some reason, the room was still lit by a single dim wall light. The conference room turned out to be the most interesting thing I saw that night, just because of its mystery and the lack of any context. The first sub-level seemed to be seldom used. Maybe it sprang to life when a new contract for experimental aircraft arrived, and I'd just shown up during the slow season. But I ended up spending the night wandering empty rooms and halls, mostly looking for a way further down. It was a massive complex that I knew I didn't cover completely, and had no particular desire to continue exploring, because my gut told me it'd be more of the same. Even so, I ended the night on another high note. Around dawn, I finally found a more active portion of the level that was lit more brightly and featured up-to-date rooms with modern computers and furniture. It was a small section overall, filled with a few dozen on-duty men and women. My lip reads told me that they were mostly just talking about current events. Well, the discovery of the area led me to the central elevator that had eluded me, which required keycards. I slipped past the doors, floated up to the lift itself, and looked at the buttons to see that I had 3 more levels to check out. As the sun rose, I flew up the elevator to see where it had been hiding. I emerged into a hardened concrete bunker-like building. I passed through a blast door and drifted along into a lengthy tunnel on the other side until I was under the sky again, and at a secondary checkpoint deeper inside the base. The entrance to the lower levels had been concealed within a mountainside, and the tunnel leading to it was buried at the end of a narrow valley a good distance from the other surface buildings. It was both hard to see and well defended. I did my best to memorize the location and returned to my body once again, ready to spend another day doing almost nothing as I waited to sleep and travel once more. My next visit, I knew, was going to be a special one. I'd stocked up on microwavable meals upon arriving in Rachel, and rarely left my room, leaving the curtains drawn at all times. I knew I was messing around in a place I was never meant to see, that the government worked hard to keep a secret, so naturally I'd grown paranoid that feds or the military would somehow track me down and come banging on the door. I hadn't really felt that fear since I started exploring as a kid, back when I thought the cops of all people would show up and arrest my young self for some sort of privacy invasion crimes. I never really rationalized how they'd find me though, but, well, if anyone in the world could detect and find me, there was a good chance it might be the fine folks who have a career in Area 51. I just couldn't work out how they would either, because there were too many unknowns about what they were capable of and what they researched. If they, for example, had at some point reverse-engineered alien technology, then who knows what manner of physics they were aware of that the rest of us may never understand. While projecting, I was sending some piece of myself out into the world, something tangible, albeit difficult to detect. I was receiving information and sending it back to my brain for processing. I just happened to never have found anyone that could tell me how I did what I did, what kind of signals I might have been broadcasting that someone or something else could perceive. The fear of being caught had always dogged me. It wasn't so much the consequences that scared me as it was finding out that there existed a way to find or catch me in such a vulnerable state. This time that worry was also manifesting itself in a perhaps rather crazy concern that Area 51 had a honeypot set up in part of its base that would attract people like me and capture our projected selves for imprisonment and experimentation. I started thinking that I'd stumble upon a room full of other trapped souls who'd got too curious. It felt like the perfect twist ending to my story. I could never see myself as the first one to truly have access to astral projection. I always assumed that someone else had done it before, and there were hundreds of people like me, if not more. And if that were true, then surely someone had paid a visit to a mysterious installation in an American desert. And if that were true, said installation might have already created countermeasures. Or I could just be overthinking and over-worrying again. That was a constant consequence of living a lonely life. I have stress feedback loops in my head that have sometimes led to panic attacks. That's never been a problem while projecting. I guess that's one reason it usually makes me feel so peaceful.
Advil, the pain away.
Part 3. By the 4th night, all of my good food was gone, and the motel TV was no longer providing any entertainment. Exploring the base was all I had to look forward to, and I wanted to make the most of it. As soon as I could, I jumped straight to the main elevator and floated my way down to that second sub-level. This one was where the trains ran. Area 51 had long been rumored to have an underground rail system, though there were debates if it was just for the local use or if it connected to more distant bases, or even hidden entrances to cargo depots. The level was almost entirely pure cave, drilled away some time ago by large machines. Flatbeds ran on electric rail, transporting material and aircraft parts across the installation. There were few rooms to speak of, and the cars moved without human operators until they reached their terminus, where they were unloaded and moved by people who looked like they might have spent weeks at a time without seeing sunlight. Now, I couldn't be certain if it was always this busy on the level, or if there was some big project in the works that required constant transport of goods, but it was definitely active down there, with cars coming and going constantly. The tunnels were maze-like and sprawling, and with little signage it was easy to get lost. I must have spent around 2 hours just trying to find something more interesting than the extensive rail line itself. After I unintentionally doubled back to the elevator, I chose to take it down again instead of spending further time attempting to navigate the local subway system. The third sublevel was much smaller than the first, and looked entirely different. Its corridors were narrow, confining, and featured more metal than concrete or natural rock. It was reminiscent of the interior of a nuclear submarine, and most of the people I saw walking around wore suits and ties. And those that didn't were armed guards, which was strange. What were they protecting? Or trying to keep inside this far down? Well, aliens, I hoped. Seeing a live colony of little grey guys would have made this trip more than worth it, and I couldn't wait to describe them to the world, whether or not anyone believes any part of my story. But there was something weird and concerning about this floor. For one, I could no longer pass through the walls. I could push my way through some of the metal siding, but something inside the wall stopped me. Nor could I get through the bulkhead-style doors if they were closed, which severely limited my ability to explore the floor. I was able to get a peek inside a room when someone went into it, or left one of them open occasionally, but they always got closed again, like there was a protocol. If I'd gone into any room, I would probably end up trapped inside it, and that was a risk I couldn't take. What little I did see of the offices and labs on this floor didn't suggest that aliens had ever been kept there, not that I had high expectations. The fact that I couldn't go through the walls, or the floor and ceiling for that matter, was something new to me. There must have been some sort of energy field inside them, maybe there to block something else, some kind of signal, but by extension they limited my mobility in the process. Seeing the sublevel as a dangerous place to linger, I returned to the elevator and dropped downward to the fourth and presumably lowest level. Only I descended into darkness and something solid. I was already on the bottom floor, at least that the elevator serviced. Either they filled the space below with concrete to seal it off, or there never was another sub-level and the button in the lift was just a dummy for whatever reason. I went back to looking through the third level's hallways to see if I'd missed something. The old hanging wall clocks inside showed me that it was 3 a.m, so I still had a few more hours before my body would start trying to wake up and ask where its owner was. I had the idea that the floor below, if it existed, might still be accessible somewhere else. Passing hallway after hallway and going down each side of an intersection, I got a closer look at the weapons in the hand of each patrolling guard whenever I got a chance. They didn't seem like any sort of gun I was familiar with. They actually looked non-lethal, and their barrels were equipped with a panel of lights that surrounded some sort of beam emitter. They had the appearance of a sci-fi laser rifle, but logic told me that they were likely deterrent weapons, which may have fired off bright bursts of light and a powerful laser, or burning microwave energy. It made no sense. If someone managed to get all the way down here after dodging all the real bullets up above, why give the guards at the heart of the base rifles like this? Unless, as I already speculated, they were keeping something inside, and these were the only weapons that could contain it. Eventually, I noticed something lining the segments where the hallways were connected by seams and rivets. Every few meters, there were thin strips of metal and LED lights that ran along the wall, floor, and ceiling. I didn't think much of them at first, thinking they were part of a peculiar emergency light system. At least that was, until I randomly set one of them off. The moment I did so was one of the scariest moments of my life so far. I can't really explain why I only triggered one of the apparent sensors long after I began traversing the level. At the time, all I could think about was how anything in the world would be able to pick up my presence. The LEDs lit up in a pulsing red to attract attention, and my dampened hearing just barely picked up an alarm. This was all so bizarre and new to me that I froze up and just floated there, feeling exposed and helpless. Guards rushed in like they were trained to do, despite how rarely, if ever, this sort of thing actually happened. They couldn't see me, but they swept their weapons about like they were searching, and some of the men had what appeared to be scanners on their wrists. They were trying to find something invisible, like a ghost. I'd say that was absurd, but I'm someone who can send my own spirit out into the world. The existence of ghosts was never a big leap for me. The younger guys soon looked a little less nervous about what they were doing, and one of the older ones deactivated the alarm as the whole group continued searching. I was still too freaked out to focus much on their lip movements, but it was obvious that this was a major event for them. They looked at the other hall sensors to see if any of the other ones were going off, and one of the men swept his scanner right over my position. Reflexively, I held my non-existent breath as he did so, but he didn't seem to pick up anything. I kept still and watched the entirety of the procedures as they followed. The situation was called in over the radio. The men finished their scans and began to disperse, except for the one guy who waited for a technician to show up, who then checked the sensor for a malfunction. The tech even plugged a wire into a port near the sensor and ran some software checks on a tiny portable computer. I only started moving again once the IT guy had finished up and left. In total, the delay and my abundance of caution had cost me an hour. I'd have to return to my body soon, but first I convinced myself to press on ahead even after what seemed to be my detection. Now wary of the sensors every time I passed one, I stayed calm as if to keep my astral energy output low, and continued down a particularly long hallway that ended at a promising, large chamber. It was the most secured place I'd seen yet. A circular room with only 2 exits, and covered by multiple security cameras and automated weaponry. The turrets in the same non-lethal design as the things the guards were armed with. Ahead of me was a large segmented blast door, painted orange and black, with the faded numbers 01 painted on its stainless steel surface. Like the rest of the floor, I couldn't pass through the barrier, and I already really wanted to find out what was on the other side. It probably held whatever the guards were keeping down here and were worried about, sure, but it didn't matter. I wanted in. For my journey all the way out here and the risks to be worth it, I needed in. I waited for as long as I could, on the off chance someone would open it, but had to return to the surface once I felt the connection to my body beginning to wane. I returned to it just as I was waking up, a lust in my gut to see just what the base's biggest secret might have been. Getting past that door was already my new obsession. It was like the Area 51 of Area 51, my childhood dream reignited. I would never get answers from anyone in the world, and the odds of finding out what was inside by peeking at any visible papers or computer screens throughout the base seemed non-existent. I'd seen a lifetime share of an incredibly exclusive place, and of course, because of human nature, I still had to see that final secret.
New Goldfish Megabytes, the bigger, bolder, cheesier Goldfish reboot.
Part 4. Well, the 5th day was agonizing. Not just because of the wait to get back under the base. It was also when the Area 51 raiders started showing up. There might have only been a few hundred that actually went through with coming out to the desert to party, get drunk, and live out their alien rescue fantasies. But the motel, my sanctuary, filled up with rowdy out-of-towners, while camper van and motorcycle engines ruined the quiet atmosphere. All day I thought about the door and what was behind it. Was it a new super-advanced aircraft? A deconstructed alien starship? The skeletal remains of an ancient god? I would have accepted an empty warehouse, just as long as I found out for certain and didn't go through the rest of my life not knowing. I had no idea what was driving my urges, only that I wanted to see something truly special before heading home. And so far, I felt like I hadn't. After hours of television and internet browsing just to pass the time, all while staying inside my room to avoid social contact, I grew unreasonably excited to see the sunset light hit my room's window. By 8 p.m., I was already in bed and trying to force myself to sleep. Since I couldn't take a sleeping aid and my new neighbors were rude and noisy, it was tortuous. I wouldn't wake up before my sleeping cycle was complete once I was out of my body, but getting there was no easy task, and it took 2 hours of restless tossing and turning. After all of that, the night was a bust. I explored very little else of the base, instead spending most of my time in that final chamber with the giant door, just waiting for someone to come along and open it. I understood that, in all likelihood, no one would have a need to while I was at the base. I just didn't want to go home thinking I'd missed a potential chance because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. In hindsight, I wish I'd seen more of the base while I had the chance instead of wasting all my time in one place hoping for the impossible. I returned to my body, disappointed, then suffered through a 6th day, my time at the hotel running out. I could extend my stay, but I felt that it would just lead to more extensions to feed an obsession when I had to get out of that nowhere town. My mom called me, as did my employer, both of them wondering when I'd come back. Responsibilities at home were putting pressure on me to finish my time in Nevada, and my room's air conditioner was now just barely working, and a repair guy wouldn't be coming anytime soon. I was miserable, but I had to stay just a little longer. I almost spent the night dreaming instead, just to escape from reality for a while. I'd never projected for 6 nights in a row, so I only ever saw the reprieve of darkness during the few naps I had over the week. And then no one showed up to open that damn door for me again. Every time I was about to leave that security room to explore more of the base, I convinced myself that someone was on their way to let me through. But it never happened. 10 hours I spent lingering on that sub-level I could only barely navigate. Hell, I even tried sending psychic waves to the people down there in an effort to manipulate them into unlocking that door. Didn't work. I woke up early in the morning, sweating and feeling pissed off. I knocked on my walls and yelled at the people next door to turn down their music. After they told me to shut up, I left my room, packed up some water and food, and drove off. I might have been able to tolerate the desert and the heat for one more day, but not the motel room where I felt like I was losing my mind. I actually ended up driving down to Las Vegas and spending the day on the Strip and blowing money on tourist shows. It worked so far as it let me get my mind off of things, calm down and detox from the shut-in routine that I'd reduced myself to. Getting some actual meals at real restaurants helped as well. Still, I never wanted to come back to Nevada again. I arrived back in Rachel around sunset feeling refreshed, and instead of heading to my room, I went to the party, or rather, I just observed it from afar. The drunken, eccentric types looked like they were having more fun than I'd had over the past week. They were gathered up at the gate and just hanging out as base guards made sure they stayed back and didn't try to run inside. The raiders were smart enough not to get shot, although, as I said earlier, I did see a few of them get arrested. Their fun lasted into the night, even if they sadly never got a chance to see any aliens. But if that didn't disappoint them, I figured I shouldn't have let myself feel disappointed either. Well, I'd actually seen inside the base, unlike any of those guys. I'd fulfilled a childhood dream. I could head home right then, look back at all this in a year, and still feel excited about everything I'd witnessed inside Area 51. But, well, that would never be good enough for me, so instead I drove my car to a secluded area near the base, reclined the seat, covered all the windows, and fell asleep. If I projected this close to the place, everything would be in sharper focus, giving me a better experience, and I'd cut back on the travel time to my body. I was determined to leave the state on a high note. Once I was adrift, I floated over to the party by the main gate, went right by the revelers, and then past the guards that stopped them from going any further. If only they could see me and cheer as they watched just another regular dude making his way inside the base. Well, I've made fun of them, but I'd slowly start to see the guys as a good luck charm as the night progressed. Before I'd even arrived at the elevator, I saw something new and worth following. 2 people in full hazmat suits with tinted visors that hid their faces came walking out of one of the side rooms within the mountain tunnel. They were pushing a cart with a large metal crate on top. Even if they had nothing to do with that final door, I wanted to find out what they were up to, so I tagged along without them knowing. were heading across the lower sublevel together, I tried my hardest to contain my excitement, which was the only thing I could think of to avoid setting off any alarms again. The hazmat boys nearly broke my heart the moment they made a right at the last junction before the door. But it turned out that they were only having their keycards programmed in the surveillance room. It was filled with camera feeds on a TV array, and had a single guard watching them all, including the 4 cameras pointed at the big door. It must have had codes that changed daily as an extra layer of security. Once their keys were updated, we arrived at the last obstacle. They ran the cards onto 2 separate scanners, pressed down 2 red buttons with their thumbs, and then finally pulled the 2 levers within the door itself. Maybe this was something they did on a weekly basis, or it could have been an annual thing and I'd just gotten extremely lucky. Whatever the case, the huge slab of metal at long last began to slide open, to reveal the darkness beyond. Lights flickered to life past the door, illuminating an angled concrete corridor and the hefty inclined cargo elevator that went down. The hazmat team went in and locked their cart's wheel into a pair of mounts on the lift, which didn't start moving until the big door was closed again. I was still right there with them, and was now committed, having no way out until they left first. The elevator went downward at a tepid pace, and I stayed with my 2 new best friends instead of going on ahead with them. I'd come this far, so I was willing to be patient a little longer. I was heading down into the inner sanctum of Area 51, a forbidden place very few would ever think about, much less see for themselves. The ride lasted 10 minutes or so, and it felt like we'd descended deep into the earth. If ever there was a portal to hell or another dimension, it'd be here. After the lift came to a stop, a second giant door opened as slowly as the first, revealing something perplexing but not quite bizarre just yet. Ahead of me was a purely stone antechamber, carved into bedrock. The surfaces were immaculately smooth. About 30 feet of rock, illuminated only by the elevator corridor's light, led up to a large, perfectly proportioned open square that preceded a void of darkness. The square was roughly 40 feet long on each side, so it was certainly a sizable doorway to whatever lay beyond it. It wasn't completely without technology or machinery. The opening was lined with the same sensor strips used on the 3rd floor, and there were large circular hatches built into the stone on either side of the door. I stepped out into the antechamber with the hazmat crew as they wheeled out their cargo, and looked to my sides. On the left was an old regular-sized metal door that showed signs of disrepair. While my buddies worked to unlock their crate and remove its contents, I went over to get a better look at the old side door. It appeared to lead to the original 4th sublevel, or whatever remained of it. It was unpowered and had no inner electrical field running, so I was able to pass through it and see if there was anything on the other side. But I saw only darkness, nothing at all. On further inspection, I noticed that the door had actually been jammed open just a crack. From outside, I managed to see a tiny bit of the pile of rocks that had blocked my view. It appeared that the hall had suffered a cave-in at some point, or maybe the entire floor had gone through a controlled demolition. Whatever had happened, it seemed to be completely inaccessible. I returned to the hazmat brothers as they worked together to take out their cargo. It was a giant battery, or a power cell of some kind. I understood what they were doing, replacing one of the 2 power sources that kept something in, past or around the giant square entrance running. But they couldn't just hot swap one of the batteries that easily. It looked like they had to shut the whole thing down first. On realizing this, I felt equally terrified and excited. I knew I might actually have a chance to glimpse what they were keeping all the way down here. The guys went to either side of the door, opened up 2 fuse box-looking things above the battery hatches, and flicked 2 of the switches. Nothing happened for a few seconds, and then light slowly began to warm up past the doorway. The first thing I noticed was just how many of them there were, high up on a ceiling inside the chamber. There was an entire array, like stadium lighting turned to a face-down position. Well, it was overkill for illuminating a room. One of the hazmat guys worked to exchange the power cell, while the other took up a defensive position near the center of the doorway and pointed his rifle into the brightening room past it. I will never be able to give a reason behind the place I saw. I don't think I'd be able to rationalize it, even if whoever ran the base sat me down and described it in great detail. Part 5. Kept deep inside Area 51 was a full-size lobby of a grand hotel, its style copying the architecture of the 1920s. And the more I looked at it, the more it seemed to be pulled out of history.
Make room for happiness at Haverty's, where you can save $100 off every $1,000 you spend.
It wasn't like a movie set or an attempt at a replica. It had Roman pillars, marble tile, a mahogany reception desk with a classic candlestick phone in black. Most of the hard materials were in good condition, but the fabric, like the red carpet and the drapes covering the walls, were falling apart and covered in dust. Behind the cloth hanging from the ceiling were the remnants of floral wallpaper, curled and melting into the floor. It was like the lobby had been sliced cleanly out of a building and transported directly here. The outer edges of the walls looked sharp. Without any signage, it was difficult to tell where it had come from, but it did certainly look like it had served wealthy clientele in a major American city a century ago. And now, here it was, a hotel lobby out of time and place. Something unimaginably evil might have happened inside its walls in the distant past, or it could have simply been haunted or cursed. Other possibilities I thought of upon seeing it were that the very matter of the structure had been corrupted, and it was contained here to contain the spread, or that maybe it really had just been transported from the past through some wormhole experiment gone wrong. Drawn to the large room and not really thinking about it, I drifted forward and through the open-air doorway. I met resistance on my way inside, yet pushed through with minimal effort. There was something about the room that made these guys contain it, fear it, and point their weapons at it, but I figured that whatever it was, it couldn't hurt me. I'd just take a quick look around, and when they finished changing the batteries for the lights, I'd leave with them. Every little detail of the hotel, from the counter's brass call bell to the yellowed mail envelopes that would eternally wait for their recipients, and looked like they'd fall apart if touched, well, it was all too authentic to be part of a recreation. It was also in good enough condition to suggest that the place had been moved here a long time ago and preserved as if it was in a museum. Whether it had been perfectly rebuilt brick by brick or somehow brought here instantly, my untrained eye was unable to tell. At full brightness, the lights above also completely bathed and drenched the lobby, and probably made the heat unbearable as well, if I could feel it. I could have spent the rest of the night thinking about the purpose, history, and storage costs of the hotel lobby, or just exploring it, but I didn't want to linger at the deep end of a containment chamber. I turned to leave, drifting back to the massive entrance, and, damn my luck, I almost made it. I didn't realize I was trapped at first. I thought nothing of the fact that one of the hazmat guys had fully inserted the other battery, shut and locked the hatch, and hit a lever to draw power from it. In my mind, they were only there to keep the lights going. It turned out that they actually powered an invisible barrier within the square doorway. It was the same kind of field within the metal walls above that kept me from going through them. And my dumb ass had just gotten stuck inside the hotel lobby crypt. The two finished up with their task, packing up the discharged battery into the crate and wheeling it away and back to the lift. I shouted at them as best I could, but of course they would never hear me. I hit the barrier with my ghostly fists, hoping to cause a reaction that would alert them to my presence. But that was also to no effect. I felt a brief glimmer of hope when they turned around and walked back to the sides of the doorway, but they only did so to turn off the powerful lights. The lamps didn't go dark instantly. The hundreds of bulbs above me had a dim afterglow that would linger for a few minutes, giving the lobby a few lit candles worth of illumination. But I knew that I'd soon be trapped in darkness, for at least a week or at most years. All the while my body rotted away in my car far above the surface, where it would be cooked by the sun. So, that was it. I'd gotten myself killed. Or maybe I'd go on even without a body, trapped down here for centuries outside of a physical form. I thought about all of the places I would never get to see, and my poor mom wondering what had happened to me. The only two people who could let me out disappeared behind the elevator door, after which I drifted over to the center of the hotel lobby, feeling completely despondent and resigned. The fading warmth of the lights looked like they'd keep me out of total darkness for another few minutes. I didn't want to think about my fate, or how long I might consciously be down in that place before everything faded away. I'd never failed to return to my body before. There could have been some chance I'd just wake up and be fine, but I couldn't see that happening, especially not while I was in a chamber seemingly made to contain the same force I'd tapped into to project myself. The lights dimmed further. I could barely see anything. Colors had left the lobby, and there were only faint, dark shapes. I knew that pure darkness awaited me, and never anything else. A piece of me would be trapped here forever. And then, a voice spoke to me. I swear, for the first time in my projected form, I heard a voice directed towards me, and it came in clearly. "I see you," it said in a deep, disjointed English from somewhere in the abyssal dark. "And what manner of being would you be?" I wasn't alone after all. I didn't dare move. I was so scared it felt like my spectral form had begun to lose coherence and break apart. If I was in my body, I'd be feeling a heart pound through my chest, or falling into a daze or panic. But in my state, true terror could only diminish my ability to remain an existing, thinking being. I had never come closer to experiencing a degree of fear that could have that effect. The entity that produced the voice grew closer and whispered into my ear from behind. "I do think I have been here long enough. Perhaps you are a means toward freedom." Just before the light was replaced by blackness, I saw and felt something pierce straight through where my spine and heart would be. Long, pale fingers twisted around and curled upward, reaching for my spectral eyes. The skeletal appendages were like spider legs and ended in sharpened claws. It wasn't a ghost or a demon or a powerful psychic alien that had been down here for a long time and had wasted away. It was something else entirely, and I'll never know for certain just what. But its presence was ripping apart the link to my body. It said one last thing. "Now, bring me to you." And I felt an incredible burning sensation tear through me. The next thing I can remember was suddenly waking up in my motel room, on the floor and tangled up in my blankets, with my shoes still on. It was 11 in the morning, the last hour of my stay. Somehow I'd escaped from the prison, returned to my body, and made it all the way back to the motel. I looked out of my window and saw my car, messily parked across two spaces and scuffed up, like I'd driven back while intoxicated. I packed and checked out within 10 minutes, not even changing my clothes. Then I drove straight out of Nevada without stopping. I expected the police or military to chase after me or set up roadblocks, but the highway was just about empty all the way to the border. No one knew that I'd gone into that prison cell, or anywhere else at all on the base. When I finally got home, I ate a microwave meal, turned off all the lights in my apartment, silenced my phone, and slept for about 14 hours. I was only calm enough the next morning to start to actually process what I'd been through and begin writing it all down. My long sleep had been dreamless, but I didn't think much of it at the time. During the day, I started to feel tired much earlier, and I suffered through a murky brain fog, like I was disassociating with myself, making my already boring job harder to get through. I got better over time, but I lost two things permanently as a consequence of my mistakes. It's been years and I still haven't had a single dream since then. I go to bed and then wake up, and it's like no time has passed for me. In relation to that ailment, I can no longer astral project either. A part of myself is gone forever. A year ago I got my brain scanned at a hospital. It didn't reveal what was wrong with me or help me find a treatment. But I did learn that all of the parts of my grey matter that have anything to do with dreaming were much more active than average, even though I wasn't actually dreaming anymore. I think that whatever I encountered freed me, but also found a way back to my body as a payment for that freedom, and took up residence somewhere in my mind. That entity now gets 8 hours or more a night to come out and do whatever potentially evil, demented deeds that it wants. It doesn't speak to me or share visions of its motives, but I have no reason to think it's benevolent. The people working in Area 51 tried to contain it, and they even knew how to detect it and maybe subdue it with light and other forms of energy. At least until I came along and gave it a way out. I survived, and do what I can to keep others safe, including locking my bedroom door with a key each night to keep myself from sleepwalking or leaving the house in some dangerous, possessed state. But I don't think physical manipulation is what it's after, or maybe I'm an imperfect vessel for the entity, and it's out there each night looking for another. Well, there's a chance my actions have hurt someone you know, and for that I sincerely apologize. I'll soon be moving to one of the country's most rural areas, but I'm not sure yet if I could find a house that's 30 miles away from another innocent person. I'll accept a solitary life with no dreaming if I have to, but I need some time to track down a suitable place to live. Until then, I'll stay on the road, so that no single cluster of people has to experience the terror I carry, and, with any luck, no pattern will be found and no suspicion falls upon me. I may be able to stop all of this if I ended my life, or if I turn myself in at Area 51, but I'm sorry, I'm still too selfish and cowardly to do either. And for my mum's sake and my friends, I can't stay close to home. You see, every night, 1 or 2 people within a 30-mile radius of me die from a sudden brain hemorrhage. The local news picked it up and called it a possible local epidemic, and that's when I made the connection and blamed myself. And I've been on the move ever since. I've turned myself into a walking bioweapon, and my only remaining hope is that if you should have the misfortune to meet the thing I'm carrying around, any possible pain or terror you experience is brief. Again, I'm sorry. It's a terrible mistake to squander a gift, but worse still to misuse it. Well, I've been reading some great stuff recently, and I think that one is just as good as the other good ones I've been reading recently, if that makes sense. If that sentence makes any sense. Well, that's what you get for trying to do the ending immediately after reading an hour-long story. Well, another good one. I'll be back on my other channel tomorrow night with the podcast. Back here again on Friday. It's a hot one today, 35-ish degrees here. So, brain is definitely getting a bit fried. Time for me to shut up. Till the next time, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.
At Vega, we've blended oats, spinach, cacao, and peanuts with plant-based protein to make a delicious ultra-smooth smoothie that's ready in a flash. New Vega Real Food Smoothie. Just scoop, shake, and...
The test had gone horribly wrong. It was supposed to be a quick and simple test, activate the Philadelphia Drive, dematerialize the spacecraft and ourselves from our universe, materialize at the target universe, gather some data, and then return to our original one. NASA had reassured us that this would not take more than 10 minutes to do this, start to finish. This was the first test after all, so they didn't want us staying in another universe longer than necessary. So our goal in this test was to get as much data as possible from the target universe and return immediately, thus paving the way for future missions. I have to admit, I was very excited at first. I was already happy to be accepted into the program, but to be a part of the first mission to cross into another universe made me ecstatic. The idea of being one of the first humans to cross universes thrilled me, and I felt so proud to have been chosen. Years of learning about the Philadelphia Drive and training for the possible rigors of inter-universal travel had finally led to that moment where I and my crewmates would make our marks in history. If everything goes as planned, we would return back as heroes. However, things didn't go as planned. Everything was normal at first. In fact, it felt exactly like the training and practice runs which we had rehearsed hundreds of times. As the pilot of the spacecraft, my job was to make sure the vessel and all its systems were working and fully functional. Going through the checklist and communicating with Mission Control on Earth, I checked and double-checked all systems until me and the flight controllers on the planet were satisfied with the data that we were receiving. I didn't have much of a role in the operation of the Philadelphia Drive itself, as that was regulated to the mission commander, the chief engineer, and the senior researcher on board. However, I and the rest of the crew had basic knowledge on how it works, as well as its basic maintenance. We are being sent into another universe, and so is NASA. In its habit of having backups and backups for the backups, ensured that every member of the crew had to know how to operate and repair the device in case of emergency. Once all system inspections were conducted and completed by all stations, and as the final minutes before the driver's activation had ticked by, Mission Control conducted one last check to see if everyone was ready for the mission. Listening to the comms network, I smiled in satisfaction as each flight controller gave a hearty approval for the mission to proceed. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Capcom, go. Surgeon, go. Network, go. Drive, go. On and on they went, going through each station, until fellow astronaut and current Capcom Will Hardy said the sweet words that we had all been waiting for. Heart of Gold, this is Houston. You are go for Philadelphia Drive activation. Roger that, Houston. Mission Commander Larry Johnson replied, before giving the crew a thumbs up with his gloved hands. Smiling at this, I then looked at the mission clock and saw that there was only a minute left before the drive was activated. Making sure that my seat straps were tight and secure, I then looked at my control panels and made sure that the ship's systems were still good. At the time, I don't remember feeling scared. Excited, yes. Scared, no. Maybe this was because NASA had sent out an unmanned spacecraft to the same target universe and had managed to return said spacecraft unharmed. And data collected from those missions had concluded that travel to another universe was safe for humans. And I think that was enough to assure me that everything was going to be okay. And to me, at least at the time, the safe return of the unmanned spacecraft and the positive data it gave was enough to convince me that inter-universal travel was safe. At the same time, I guess I was too drowned in excitement to feel scared. Like I said, first humans to cross to another dimension. The target universe that we would be going to and the one which the unmanned spacecraft had visited was one that was very similar to our current one. It had Earth, the Moon, and the rest of our solar system, just like the one that we have now. Everything in that universe was like ours. Well, except for the fact that Earth had no humans, at least according to the previous mission. Scans from the unmanned spacecraft had revealed that aside from plant life and some animals, The planet was devoid of intelligent life. Because of that, it made that universe the perfect test bed for future missions, since NASA didn't want to make contact with humanity in another universe. At least not yet, that is. As the last seconds counted down, and as the Philadelphia Drive began powering up and shaking the spacecraft, I gave one last glance towards the moon that we currently orbited, and knew that I would soon be seeing a different moon from a different universe. "Alright everybody, get ready," Commander Johnson called out, as I returned my gaze towards my control panel. "Activating drive in 3, 2, 1. Flashes of light of every color shone through our cockpit window as I felt my whole body shake from the vibrations the spacecraft was making. Around 50 meters behind me through various halls and compartments, the Philadelphia Drive was doing its job in transporting us from our universe to our target one. I felt no pain as this happened, and the shaking was actually very mild. In fact, launches from ground to space actually felt more violent than what I was experiencing as we jumped from one universe to another. However, during this process, something wrong had happened. An alarm suddenly screeched, which was followed by another and another. Chief Engineer Harold McKnight was the first one to report. "My commander, one of the drive's cooling systems has malfunctioned," he said as I scanned my control panel to see that smoke had been detected in the compartment where the drive was stored. Checking the monitor that showed a live video feed of the compartment, I saw that the important drive was the cause of the smoke, as a chunk of it had seemed to be missing and torn apart. However, before I could report this, senior researcher Diane Lincoln spoke up. "The drive is overheated and a portion of it is blown up, Commander," she said in a calm voice, as if there was no danger to the news that she had just told us. "The system is now undergoing an automatic shutdown and is powering down. I suggest that everybody get ready, because we're about to materialize." "Where?" Commander Johnson asked, as he activated the extinguishers after I finally managed to report to him about the smoke detected in the driver's compartment. Before Diane could reply, we were then violently thrown forward, as the bright, colorful lights shining from our cockpit suddenly disappeared. Thanks to our straps, we were held secure to our seats. However, a sudden and painful headache struck me immediately, as I groaned from the sudden pain that it caused. It felt so bad that I wanted to open my helmet and pressed my hand firmly against my forehead. It took every strength of willpower within me to resist this urge, as I knew that it was not wise to open a helmet without first checking if the compartment was completely pressurized, since there was no telling if the spacecraft took any structural damage from the jump. However, the pain was hard to ignore and it momentarily paralyzed me from doing my duty. To add to my pain, I also felt extremely dizzy, as I felt the urge to vomit. It was terrible, and I wondered what could have caused this sudden sensation. Managing to turn my head and gaze towards Commander Johnson, I was surprised to see that a pained expression was also plastered on his face. Willing myself to look towards my back, I saw that Harold and Diane were also in pain. I found this strange, as headaches and nausea were not supposed to be felt after a jump. At least that's what NASA had told us. So either this was a side effect that we were just not discovering, or there was something else to it. The pain somehow subsided long enough for us to regain some composure and check up on one another. Once this was done, Commander Johnson questioned Diane on where we were. "I don't know, Commander," Diane finally said, a reply none of us expected. I had hoped that she would say that we had materialized back in our universe or maybe even in the target one, but to not know where we ended up, it brought a chill down my spine. "It seems like the explosion somehow disrupted the jump and knocked the drive off course," she reported, as she worked her computer to check for our location. "We're now in a new universe that isn't in NASA's records. Oh God, this place is completely devoid of stars." This caught my attention, as I looked out of the cockpit window for the first time since we got here, What Diane said was true. The universe outside was really without stars. Looking out with awe and fear, I found myself staring at nothing but an empty canvas of black. It felt terrifying staring at it. Space was supposed to be filled with the bright glow of celestial bodies. It was never empty. So to see it like this, so dark and so barren, it made me feel so small and isolated. I never knew such a simple void could be so terrifying, yet it was. Pushing my head closer towards the window, my eyes soon darted around to try and look for anything in the darkness, but there was nothing. It was empty. It seemed like there was nothing in this universe but us. Eventually, I managed to pull myself out of the trance of staring at the empty void and return my attention towards my crewmates. "I don't like this place," Commander Johnson finally said, a hint of fear and frustration in his voice. "All right, what is the extent of the drive's damage? Can it be repaired?" "I'll have to check it out first before I can answer that, Commander," Diane said as she began unbuckling her straps and prepared to go check on the drive. She had been one of the scientists who had helped develop the drive itself, so there was no one else on board who knew it better than her. "All right, take Harold with you and report to me as soon as possible." "Roger that, Commander," Harold said, as he began unbuckling his own straps. However, by that point, Diane was already floating around out of the cockpit and making her way through the hall that led towards the drive's compartment. "I better call on the rest of the crew to see if anyone was hurt by what happened," Commander Johnson said, as Harold left the room. The crew at the lower deck had been quiet since the drive's activation, and Commander Johnson was starting to get worried for them. "Go check on the spacecraft and see if we took any other damage from the explosion." Checking the spacecraft, I was relieved to see that no other damage seemed to have occurred. Inspecting the drive's compartment, I reported that there was no structural damage or leaks in the room, and that there was no more smoke detected in it either. However, Commander Johnson seemed too busy and distracted to acknowledge my report. Looking towards him, I watched as he called on the rest of the crew through the local comms network, but there was no reply. Despite constant calls for them to report in, the 4 crew members kept quiet. Finding this odd, my first instinct was to check the camera that gave us a look of their compartment. However, instead of the usual sight of 4 suited astronauts in their seats, I instead saw nothing but a black smudge. It seemed like something was smeared on the lens, but I wasn't exactly sure what it was. Getting increasingly worried about the safety of his crew members on the lower deck, Commander Johnson ultimately decided to personally go down to see if they were all right, ordering me to stay put and monitor the spacecraft systems. He then unstrapped himself and floated out of the compartment, and with that I was left all alone, with my headache slowly coming back again. Knowing that the compartment was now safe and airtight, I momentarily lifted my visor so I could rub the aching spot on my forehead, but it was no use and it gave me no relief. The pain was still there and it seemed to get worse by the second. Wanting to distract myself from the pain, I decided to look out the cockpit window in hopes of making my mind focus on something other than the pain. However, I would soon regret this decision as I saw something that terrified me more than I was earlier. I had expected to see the empty void once more, but this time there was something floating in space. It was a head, but it wasn't just a head, it was my head. I backed up on my seat as I saw this, as I felt fear run through me. Staring at it with frightened eyes, I found myself looking directly at my own eyes, which stared back at me with a cold and soulless gaze. I couldn't believe it, and I had to blink my eyes a couple of times to make sure what I was seeing was real. Right in front of me, floating in the cold vacuum of the void, was my head. It looked so alike to me, yet at the same time I could tell that there was no life in it. It was terrifying seeing that, but I couldn't help but keep my eyes fixed on it. Both curiosity and fear were surging through me, as I wondered how a copy of my head ended up out there, What had created it? How was a copy of my head made so quickly during the short time that we had been here? What was it made of? So many questions circled my mind as I felt the headache hit me once more. Feeling the powerful wave of pain surge again, I instinctively pushed my hand to my forehead to meet the oncoming rush. However, instead of touching my forehead, I was shocked to feel nothing but air. Eventually, my hand ended up touching the inner back part of my helmet before I suddenly withdrew my hand in fright. For a moment, I was in disbelief, but then I brought my hand back into my helmet and felt nothing. I pulled back my hand before putting it in again, and then did it again and again and again, as I felt my stomach drop in horror. As I stopped inserting my hand into my helmet, I slowly looked out the window and once more gazed outside to see that the head was still there, floating freely while its cold stare was still directed at me. I began to fear that the head floating out there may not just have been a copy of my head, but instead my actual one. That shouldn't be possible. In fact, it made no sense. Yet I couldn't explain what had just happened. Somehow the universe had did something that wouldn't have been possible on our own. My mind was clouded with confusion and fear at that moment as I sat there staring. I can't remember how long I stared at my own floating head, but eventually I snapped out of the trance when I heard Diane call out in the local intercom. "Commander, this is Diane," she began. "The damage to the drive doesn't seem too bad. It just needs a simple replacement of some parts. I already have Harold getting the spares as we speak." There was a pause as Diane waited for a reply from Commander Johnson, but the comms remained silent. "Commander," Diane called out again, but once more there wasn't a reply. At this point, I was starting to worry for the commander. I hadn't heard from him since he went down to check on the crew, and there was no way for me to check on him from the cockpit. Fearing for his safety and the safety of the crew on the lower deck, I decided to check on them and see what was going on there. After informing Diane that the commander had gone down to check on the lower deck crew, and that I hadn't had communication with him since he left, I then told her that I would go down there also and see what the situation was. I deliberately neglected to inform her what I saw outside the ship and what had occurred to me, since I didn't want to distract her from the meticulous task of repairing the crucial drive. I wanted her to focus on her task so we could get out of this universe as soon as possible. And besides, since I was going down, I would eventually see the commander and the chief medical officer, who would probably be better suited to help me. With that in mind, I pulled down my visor, unstrapped myself from my seat, and left the cockpit without looking back at the head that I knew was still staring at me. Making my way through the spacecraft, I went through the hall and pushed myself down the tube that led to the lower deck. However, upon reaching the hall that led towards the crew compartment there, I immediately knew that something bad had occurred. The hall was dark, far darker than it should have been if the lighting was turned on. Looking around, I noticed that the wall panels were covered in something strange. Deciding to move closer towards it, I observed that it was some sort of skin coating it. Repulsed by this, I quickly drew back, but ended up pushing myself too far and hitting the panels behind me. A sticky substance soon stuck to the rear of my suit, and I turned around to see that the fleshy skin that covered that panel was leaking the thick liquid from pores that dotted its surface. Trying my best to ignore the creepy-looking surface, I decided to stay strong and continue on towards the crew compartment. However, as I floated towards its hatch, I noticed that the skin-like material seemed to cover all the panels of the hallway. Luckily, the hatch itself didn't seem to be covered in it, so I was easily able to pull it open to peer inside the compartment. What I saw was not what I had expected. Like the hall, the compartment's wall panels were covered by the fleshy skin. However, it was much more disgusting, as the flesh here was not completely covered in skin. Some parts had muscle exposed. In fact, the skin on some portions seemed to be floating next to it, as if peeled and with only a small portion left, connected with the muscle. It was a horrifying sight, but that was not the main thing that caught my attention. Flattened on the panels, there were 4 faces, eyes looking and staring at me. Staring at one of them, the face gave me a teary-eyed look, as its mouth tried to move in an attempt to speak, but no words came out. Instead, it just continued its mouth movements as it opened and closed, with a pained look plastered on its flat face. Soon, the other 3 faces did the same, as they all looked at me with desperation. It soon dawned on me who these were, and I couldn't possibly imagine how this had happened to them. Whatever was happening here was beyond the understanding of an ordinary person. This wasn't just another universe. This was something much more terrible. Feeling overwhelmed by the terrible sight and wanting to spew out the contents of my stomach, I soon began moving away from the compartment of faces and away from the fleshy hallway, making my way back up towards the cockpit. I rushed in to find that the skeleton of a human sat in the commander's seat and worked the various controls around it. Like everything else that has happened so far, it was unnatural and it defied all the logic that I knew. As I watched it for a few more seconds, I noticed it sputter something as its jaw moved up and down with each sound. Trying my best to listen, I heard it repeat the same line over and over. "We must get out. We must get out. We must get out." The voice sounded familiar and my eyes soon widened as I recognized who it was. It was Commander Johnson's voice. I was shocked to see what had happened to him, but I no longer questioned how he turned into a skeleton. This place, this universe, it was doing things to people. It seemed that it did not like our entry into its realm. Against my better judgment, I decided to slowly float behind it, moving closer and closer. As I moved towards him, I tried to call out to him, but there was no response. Instead, he just repeated the same line that he had been muttering. "We must get out. We must get out." Once I was floating just behind his seat, I cautiously patted him on the shoulder, trying to get his attention. I then saw his skull swivel and thought that he finally had noticed me. However, instead of facing me, his hollow eye sockets instead turned towards one of the monitors on the control panel. This monitor was for one of the cameras facing towards the aft, and as I gazed towards it, I saw nothing. All that was there was empty space. Switching my glance back towards the skeletal form of the commander, I looked on as he continued on staring at the screen. However, this time he was quiet. I didn't know what to do or what to say. Everything that has happened so far has been terrifying and exhausting. When the commander finally spoke again, he said something different from his earlier muttering. "It's coming after us. It's coming after us." This sent a chill through my spine as my heart began to race. I glanced towards the screen once more, but still saw nothing but the darkness of space. This frightened me even more, as the fear of the unknown made the situation feel much worse. For a moment, I wondered what exactly the commander was seeing. With this universe capable of doing things beyond our simple comprehension, there was no telling what it could produce to come after us. Images of gigantic, planet-sized beings or engulfing black holes came into my mind, but I knew that this place was capable of making horrors much worse than that. Eventually, a call through the comms by Harold interrupted me from my thoughts, as I heard his concerned voice through my headset. "Commander, this is Harold. Are you there?" The commander is busy at the moment," I decided to reply, thinking that he also shouldn't be distracted from the task of repairing the drive. I know this was a stupid and selfish thing to do, but it also spared me the great effort of explaining the unbelievable horrors through the comms. It would be better and easier for them to understand if I told them face to face, so I thought that it was best for them to wait until they were done with their task. "Oh, well, is Diane over there with you too?" This worried me. "No," I said. "Isn't she still there in the drive compartment? She's supposed to be, but when I got back with the replacement parts, she was gone. So I assumed she went back there to check on something and... Wait a minute, hold on. My worry was beginning to increase now as I moved back towards my cockpit seat to check the monitor that displayed a live view of the drive compartment. In checking the room, I saw Harold float from one corner of the room and inspect a portion of the drive. Trying to see what he was looking at, I noticed that the previously blown up portion of the part was now covered by a fleshy substance. Due to the camera angle, I couldn't see exactly what was plastered on the fleshy substance, but the sight of it clearly had spooked Harold as he backed away towards the corner of the room. "There's a face on the drive," he screamed through the comms. "A what?" I said, although I could already imagine what he was seeing. I already had an idea of whose face it may be. In my mind, it couldn't have been too different to what I saw at the lower crew decks. Before he could reply, I suddenly felt myself being gently pushed back against my seat as I saw Harold drift towards one of the walls of the compartment. Surprised by this, I scanned the panels to see what was happening and quickly realized that the 4 propulsion engines at the rear had been ignited and set to 100% power. Confused, I looked around and eventually looked towards the skeletal form of Commander Johnson to realize that he had engaged the engine and was now pushing the whole spacecraft forward, propelling the spacecraft forward. Looking ahead to see where he was pushing us towards, I saw that my floating head outside the spacecraft was now pressed against the cockpit window. I don't know how it managed to stay in that one spot, yet it somehow did. And from there, it stared at me with the same soulless gaze from earlier. Trying my best to not be trapped into the cycle of staring back at those eyes for too long, I tried to look past the head to see what lay ahead of us, but there wasn't anything there. It was only empty space, the same emptiness that surrounded us on all sides. However, despite the emptiness, the commander seemed to be seeing something in it. "We must get out, we must get out," he said, as his white bony arms began moving across the control panel, while his thin skeletal fingers began flipping switches. Observing him as he worked, and too confused and scared to do anything else, I soon realized that he was activating the drive. For a moment, this made me wonder if the drive was fully operational, and Diane and Harold had not been able to replace the blown portion, and I was unsure if the strange occurrence that had happened to it counted as a repair. But the commander did not think of that and did not seem to care. Instead, he kept on muttering the same line over and over again as he worked through the necessary procedure to activate the drive. Sitting there next to him, I allowed him to continue. It felt like we had no other choice. It seemed better to try the drive and die attempting to escape than remaining stranded in this universe of horrors. Eventually, the commander got the drive to power up, and this immediately resulted in an awful scream to run through the whole spacecraft. Initially, I didn't know where it came from. The terrible, agonized scream seemed to be emitting from everywhere. Pain and terror seemed to be contained in it as it grew louder and louder. As it kept on rising as the drive continued to power up, a small realization hit me. Managing to look towards the monitor that observed the drive compartment, I caught a glimpse of what was happening there and saw that the fleshy substance in the drive was starting to smoke. To me, it looked like meat on a heated pan. At that moment, I felt sorry for Diane. The pain she must be feeling must have been unbearable. To be burnt alive like that was something I wished I would have never experienced. Her screaming eventually reached its highest point once the drive was in full power. I wanted the terrible pained cries to stop, but there was no way of doing that. So instead, I tried to distract myself by staring out to our front, to see that my head was still pressed against the cockpit window. However, instead of the dark emptiness of the void surrounding us, a familiar flash of bright, colorful lights had now replaced it. I felt ecstatic and hopeful once that I saw it. It was working. The drive was working. For a moment, I managed to shut out the cries of Diane and instead felt joy shoot through me. We were finally leaving this universe, The horrors that it had brought would finally be gone. Feeling the spacecraft shake as the drive did its work, I let my mind be lost in happiness and the thoughts of home. Watching with glee, I looked on as the pressed hat in the cockpit had disappeared, as a bright flash of all colors engulfed my new view. Feeling myself be shoved forward, I was then violently thrust forward. Since I was not able to strap myself before the drive was activated, my body was flung forward as well, as my helmet smashed against the control panel. This resulted in my visor breaking, sending shards of sharp material to my face. Feeling the stinging pain of the cuts, I instinctively brought my hand to my face to check my wounds. As I did this, a realization hit me. My hand was touching my face. Instantly, this made me pat every portion of my face, and I was relieved to have my head on me again. I felt even more relieved when I saw a familiar white moon just outside the window. Smiling, I then turned towards the commander. However, the sight of him made me frown. His suit was gone and he was completely naked, but that was not the worrying part. Although he was no longer a skeleton, his body was severely thin. He looked like he was malnourished, as if there were no fat or muscle between his skin and bone. Looking towards me, we locked eyes for a couple of seconds before he turned his head towards the monitor that looked towards the aft of the spacecraft. Briefly, his eyes went towards the monitor that showed the drive compartment before he suddenly pressed himself back against his seat. "It's coming after us," he muttered his final words as the sounds of various alarms echoed inside the cockpit. With that, Commander Johnson had died. He had brought us home, but not everybody had made it. Just like the commander, the 4 crew members at the lower deck and Diane had died. All of them were returned to their original forms, but a quick examination of their bodies showed that their insides were not in the right place. Bones poked at all the wrong places, and a quick x-ray of their bodies revealed that their organs were also in the wrong spots. Diane also had her insides in the wrong places, but it was much harder to tell due to her changed body. I somehow got lucky that I didn't have any permanent damage, while Harold was even luckier for not having been affected by the universe. I assumed that we had managed to get out just in time before it could target him. But sadly, I don't think our hardships are over yet. When we made it back to our universe, the propulsion engines the commander had engaged were still in 100% power. By the time that I had turned all 4 of them off, its push had already slingshotted us out of the orbit of the moon. Calculations from the navigational computer show that we are currently in a trajectory that would make these spacecraft enter the Earth's atmosphere. This spacecraft is a dedicated interuniversal explorer, and it was never meant to enter the atmosphere. Because of that, Harold and I know that we would burn it up even if we don't do anything. However, a simple course correction currently cannot be done. The vessel took damage during the last jump, which resulted in the damage to 5 compartments, the reaction control system, and the communications. Harold is trying to repair the reaction control systems, while I'm working on the communication systems. If I'm successful, then maybe we can get a hold of NASA, who could then aid us in the repair of the reaction controls. However, it's been 2 days since we began our work, and we don't seem to be anywhere near close to getting any of the systems operational. At the moment, we have less than 24 hours left before these spacecraft will enter the atmosphere. With the possibility of failure being high, I decided to type this message out. I'll be saving this in these spacecraft's main memory banks. If we fail to save ourselves, I hope that at least this message will survive. I want everyone back on Earth to know what we endured. The U.S. Space Force was the first to see the spacecraft. For 3 days they tried to contact it, but they got no reply. Because of that, they could do nothing but watch as it entered the atmosphere like a meteor. Few people saw the spacecraft burn up over the Pacific Ocean. However, just to be sure, Space Force still made an announcement that the falling debris was from an old communications satellite that they deliberately deorbited and crashed into the ocean. Almost immediately after the crash site was located, the US government worked fast in order to recover the debris in order to answer the mountain of questions that many officials had. However, recovery of the debris only opened up more questions. You see, NASA doesn't have a program focused on crossing universes. They never had one in the past, and they don't have one now. In fact, they don't even plan to do one in the future. A search through all of NASA's programs revealed that there is no such thing as a Philadelphia Drive, or an interuniversal exploration spacecraft by the name of Heart of Gold. As a member of the NASA team investigating the debris of the spacecraft, I was among a select group of people trying to figure out where these spacecraft had come from. Because of this, I was able to read the terrifying message and watch the awful footage found in a memory card stored in a heat-proof capsule. This capsule, along with other pieces of debris, were recovered from the bottom of the ocean near Point Nemo. For 6 months, a joint NASA and Space Force operation worked to recover and study the debris. This was a secret operation, since the government didn't want to worry the public about a spacecraft that had come out of nowhere. However, I'm going to break the secrecy because there is something the world needs to know. All 8 bodies of these spacecraft's crew were recovered. All of them were deceased and scorched from their entry through the atmosphere. However, a couple of days ago, one of the bodies went missing from the cold storage chamber that it was kept in. Surveillance footage shows the body getting up and slipping past security, and then managed to leave the Space Force facility that it was in and disappear into the countryside. I'm posting this to warn everybody that something from outside our universe is now roaming our planet, and there's no telling what it plans on doing.
Numbers move you, but some can stop you in your tracks, like the tens of thousands of people who were diagnosed with certain HPV-related cancers. For most people, HPV clears on its own, but for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers. Gardasil 9 is a vaccine given to adults through age 45 that can help protect against certain diseases caused by HPV, including cervical, vaginal, vulvar, anal, and certain head and neck cancers, such as throat and back of mouth cancers and genital warts. Gardasil 9 doesn't protect everyone and does not treat cancer or HPV infection. Your doctor may recommend screening for certain HPV-related cancers. Women still need routine cervical cancer screenings. You shouldn't get Gardasil 9 if you've had an alert.
I am packed and ready to leave, so I've got some time to write all this down. Grandpa's talking with the 2 trucks that just pulled up, still waiting on the last one. Then we're headed north. For now, I've got time to kill. I always meant to do this, and it's officially now or possibly never. Fair warning, this is a long one, folks. 8 pages. Buckle up. And if anyone in East Texas wants to tag along, message me. We're taking as many people as we can get. This was the 3rd night in a row they were unhinged in the tree line, and my room at the end of the double-wide trailer put me right beside their ceaseless barking. I peered to the left as my thumb unlocked the iPhone screen on the nightstand. 1:30 a.m. I thought how I'd ask my dad about kenneling them on the porch, knowing he'd give me some excuse about them being necessary for our home. The first line of defense, our protectors, our alarm system. Looking back, we should have realized it then. To their credit, Daisy and Rose excelled at their duty. All manner of interloper received a billowing cascade of howls and barks on our property. I thought how scared a single raccoon, possum, or coyote must have felt when the sisters barreled into the tree line at them, shattering the peace of night. The echoes that trailed through the woods gave every impression there were more than 2 guards. None stayed to find out. They often startled me awake when the pair flew off the porch in an eruption of sound. My room filled one corner of the trailer pointing east towards our driveway, the forest a dozen yards beyond. My
Bye, everybody. Have a great night. I will continue tomorrow.